Well, thank you. Well, good morning and welcome to the second annual Joint Minority Bar Black History Month CLE presentation. I'm the Mound City Bar Association President Steve Harmon, and I'm glad to offer a welcome to those of you who are interested in a little good trouble. Mound City Bar has joined forces this year with MABA, SABA, and the Hispanic Bar Association to bring you good trouble seeking social justice in St. Louis. With this presentation, we intend to identify areas in which attorneys can be proactive in advocating to create social justice in the areas that are defining aspects of life: housing, education, and environmental health. The committee has put together an awesome speaker panel, and we will begin shortly. But first, I want to present to you the committee that put this together, and they are as follows: Celestine Dotson, the historian for the Mound City Bar Association; Alexandra Johnson, immediate past president, the Hispanic Bar Association; Rudy Angulo, Hispanic Bar Association; Francis Barbieri, Missouri Asian Bar Association; and Malini Rao, South Asian Bar Association. With that, oh, 1 second, lost the video. Sorry about that. Now we will toss the program to Rudy for a start of the first session on housing. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you enjoy this CLE.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harmon. As he so kindly introduced me, I'm Rudy Angulo, president of the Hispanic Bar Association of St. Louis and staff attorney at Arch City Defenders. Thank you all very much for coming out today. I think it's going to be a great panel. I would like to introduce to you the speakers for the housing panel, which are Yinka Faleti. He was a 2020 Democratic nominee for Missouri Secretary of State and former executive director of Forward Through Ferguson. Yinka was born in Nigeria and immigrated to the US at the age of 7. Growing up, he was no stranger to poverty. He excelled in studies and attended the United States Military Academy at West Point. After 2 back-to-back deployments overseas to Kuwait, Captain Faleti studied law at Washington University. He then practiced at Bryan Cave and as a state prosecutor in the Circuit Attorney's Office. Yinka then served as senior VP with the United Way of Greater St. Louis. There he raised $300 million to help 1 in 3 people in the Greater St. Louis region. From United Way, Yinka went on to lead as executive director of the successor nonprofit to the Ferguson Commission, Forward Through Ferguson. Next up is my coworker and dear friend, Lee Camp, who is a senior staff attorney at Arch City Defenders with the Special Projects Department. Lee joined ACD in 2017 as a direct services attorney focusing on civil consumer law, landlord-tenant law, and municipal law. He rose to the position of senior staff attorney, now focusing on assisting low-income, elderly, and disabled clients in addressing various housing needs. Lee also engages in extensive policy and media advocacy, focusing on tenants' rights. As an expert in the area of subhabitable housing, he has successfully argued on the issue before the Missouri Supreme Court, testified on legislation regarding habitability, and continues to give presentations on the issue throughout Missouri and the country. And next we have Nelson Williams, who is a partner at Thompson Colburn. R. Nelson Williams specializes in employment litigation. His work towards equity and inclusion began in college, where he was co-director of Duke's Center for Race Relations. It's work that consumed his life in the best possible way, and he's carried on since moving to St. Louis in 2007 through service on the board of Shearwater Education Foundation, on the diversity committee at his firm, and most recently as a big brother in the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. So without further ado, I would like to kick it off to our first panel, Housing First, that will be moderated by Celeste Dotson. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy. I hope everyone can hear me. I think there was a little bit of technical difficulties in the beginning, so I'll introduce myself really briefly. I'm Celestine Dotson. I'm with Mound City Bar Association, and I'm the historian, and I am very privileged to be moderating this particular panel. Thank you, gentlemen, so much. Good morning. Fellas, take yourselves off mute.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Life in the pandemic.
Yes.
Okay. All right, guys. So like I said, thank you so much for attending. And this is a huge issue, the housing issue facing St. Louis, particularly. I've seen it. I have actually, as a private attorney, dealt with some issues surrounding housing in the midst of this pandemic. And I would love to ask you and toss this out to you gentlemen. What do you think the single most driving principle that attorneys must address in considering housing advocacy right now?
I'll start things off. So this
Thank
is
you.
Nelson. This is Nelson. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So, first, and thank you for the introduction, Rudy. One of the things, I wear so many different hats these days, but one of them that I wanted to make sure and also bring forward as well is that I'm currently the co-chair of the board of directors of Ford through Ferguson. And so in that capacity, we deal with and explore and examine the ways in which the housing crisis in St. Louis has deeply impacted people of color, particularly Black folks here in St. Louis. In terms of the role that attorneys take, not to get too in the weeds, but we're all lawyers here. So, but the preamble to the ABA rules talks about the ethical obligations that we have as attorneys. And one of the things that it highlights is that it tells us that we have an ethical obligation and indeed a moral obligation to create access to those who don't have it, right? To facilitate legal representation for those who do not have it. And in that way, I always think of that when I have conversations about things like housing, about things like lack of access and resources, because the ABA rules, the guiding principle for our profession, dictates and indeed mandates for us to be guided by a moral obligation and imperative when we are out in our communities and engaging with our clients. So when I think about what are our obligations as attorneys, one of the things I continually think of is, well, I think that we are called and indeed compelled to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, to have a voice for the voiceless. And so things like housing discrimination, which we know is very much alive and well, even though it's 2021, ensuring that folks have equal access to equitable and healthy and standard housing. As part of the Ferguson Commission report back in 2015, 2016, one of the key calls to action that the Ferguson Commission realized and put into writing in the Ferguson Commission report is that there is a housing crisis that we are facing here in St. Louis, And so what I mean by that, well, there are things like, there's some studies that showed that 43% of renters in North County have an inflated cost burden. And what does that mean? Well, that means that at least 35% or more of their income is spent on housing, right? These are the statistics, these are the realities of very much of our brothers and sisters in this community. And so I think that we as attorneys have an obligation to really explore and examine and figure out ways in which we can sort of alleviate those stressors on our communities.
Yinka, you wanted to?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Rudy, for your introduction. Celestine, it's great to see you. Good morning. How is everyone? My name is Yinka Faleti. It's great to be here with you and to share the panel with my colleagues in the law, Lee and Nelson. I'm really excited to discuss this topic with you. Housing is near and dear to my heart, as it's something that our family struggled with growing up. As an immigrant family, we lived in 5 states over a span of 8 years, from 1983 to 1991. And within each state, we moved several times. I remember in 5th grade alone, I went to 3 different elementary schools. Like many families of low income, the reasons we moved were centered largely around financial security. And so whenever we couldn't afford to live in our apartment anymore, we moved to a cheaper one. or one that had a move-in special that provided temporary respite. And when we could no longer afford that, we lived in a housing project for a school year. You know, housing is a basic necessity. It's so elemental that it forms the bottom of the foundation in Maslow's hierarchy of needs triangle. But housing, as fundamental as it is, remains difficult for many American families to secure, as my family was challenged with in my youth. But, you know, housing insecurity didn't begin in 1983. It began much more before then. And so I think a critical role for us as attorneys is to understand the history of housing segregation, legal housing segregation in this country. And when we understand the history, then we can have a better understanding of what we can do. Until we know the history, it makes it harder to do, to make sure we have equity going forward. So let me talk about, you know, and before I go on, I want to say that I like Alex Johnson, I like Steve Harmon, I like Celeste Dotson, I like Rudy Angulo, and many of the others who were instrumental producing the CLE. I know them, they're friends, but they have absolutely set me up to fail. There is no way on God's green earth I can cover the history of legal segregation of housing in this country in 7 minutes. But I'm gonna do my best. But what I can do is give you, in answering Celestine's question, a several minutes primer. So let's talk. I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about the Shelley v. Kramer case and its historical role. I want to talk about Levittown and its role in the proliferation of suburban housing for returning World War II veterans and Americans generally. And I want to talk about redlining. And I'll probably go over 7 minutes, so I'll beg Celestine's forgiveness in advance. Now, this is Black History Month, and there's no better month to talk about housing and legally sanctioned discriminatory policies and practices in our country's history and present. But to understand the present, we have to understand the past and how we got here. Yes, here in St. Louis, of course. St. Louis was on the cutting edge of state-sanctioned housing discriminatory practices. Who can forget the landmark Shelley v. Kramer case, 334 U.S. 1, the 1948 U.S. Supreme Court case that held that racially restrictive covenants, standing alone, do not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, the court held further that while private parties may abide by the terms of such a covenant, they may not seek judicial enforcement of the covenant, as that would constitute a state action. Now, let's recall briefly the facts of the case. In February 1911, 30 out of 39 property owners in what is today the Greaterville neighborhood entered into a restrictive covenant, providing that for a term of 50 years, property in that neighborhood could not be sold to any Black or Asian person. Now, for over 34 years, that covenant stood without a legal challenge that I'm aware of. But in August of 1945, that changed. J.D. and Ethel Lee Shelley bought and took possession of a house from the Fitzgerald family. Now, the Shelleys were, at the time of purchase, unaware of a restrictive covenant that ran with the house. And so the Marcus Avenue Improvement Association was the local homeowners association. That HOA brought suit in Circuit Court in St. Louis City to enforce the restrictive covenant, asking the court to enjoin the Shelleys from taking possession and to divest ownership. Now, the trial court ruled that the covenant was unenforceable because not all of the property owners had signed the original covenant. Remember, only 30 of the 39 owners had signed on. On appeal, the Missouri Supreme Court reversed, ruling that the covenant was enforceable, as it was purely a private agreement between the original parties, and further that the Equal Protection Clause did not guarantee any rights to the Shelleys with respect to the covenant. The U.S. Supreme Court granted certiorari and held that state enforcement of such covenants violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And this, in effect, is what ended restrictive covenants in America in 1948 by that decision. But lest we think this was just a St. Louis problem, there was a companion case being adjudicated in Detroit at the same time as well. Now, that case was Sykes v. McGee, 25 Northwest 2nd, 638. In that case, the McGee's purchased land subject to substantially similar restricted covenant as in the Shelley case. And the Michigan Supreme Court held that the covenant was enforceable, just like, remember, the Missouri Supreme Court did in the Shelley case. And so the US Supreme Court consolidated Shelley and the Sipes cases and considered them together. So this wasn't just a St. Louis problem. So that's a great segue into, well, where else was this problem? Well, let's talk about Levittown. Now, restrictive covenants weren't the only innovation of discriminatory housing practices. The end of World War II propelled the massive growth of suburbs across the country. Abraham Levitt and his sons, William and Alfred, played an important role in the proliferation of suburbs all over this country. They constructed 4 of these suburban communities called Levittowns. One was in New York, another in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and one in Puerto Rico. Now, beginning in 1947 in Levittown, Long Island, 2,000 of these homes were originally planned to be built in this suburban community. But they were so popular that 6,000 would ultimately be built. Now, why were they so popular? Well, each home came complete with a TV and a modern kitchen and cost just around $8,000. Now, remember, back in the 1940s, TV was still very, very novel. Remember, it was invented only in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and became kind of more massively produced. So this was a big deal. And the fact that it cost just $8,000 was a big deal as well. Now, the GI Bill for returning veterans lowered the cost to about $400, which today would be around $4,500. And today, the median Levittown home is worth around $400,000. So this was a bargain. Now, toward the end of World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, more commonly known as the GI Bill. Now, benefits of the bill were supposed to inure to all veterans who had been on active duty during World War I or II for at least 90 days and had been honorably discharged. Benefits included low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans to start a business or a farm, unemployment insurance, and tuition assistance for education. So who benefited from this new sprawling housing boom made accessible for returning veterans by the GI Bill? Consider this. In the New York and northern New Jersey suburbs, the GI Bill insured some 67,000 mortgages. The number of those mortgages that went to non-whites numbered less than 100. In 1947, in the 13 cities in Mississippi, there were 3,229 VA guaranteed home loans. The number of those home loans that went to Black borrowers, just 2. Back to Levittown. Eugene Burnett was a World War II veteran. He happened to be Black. In 1949, he wanted to settle with his wife, Bernice, and their family into the new Levittown suburb in Long Island. Now, when he inquired about buying a house in a suburb, he was told he couldn't because of his hue. Not only was Burnett shut out of the post-World War II housing boom, so were some 1.2 million other Black veterans. As an Army veteran myself, I find this part of American history deeply disturbing. But why would suburbs like the Long Island Levittown and establishments not allow Blacks in? And what role did the federal government play in all this? After all, the government merely backed the loans. It left it up to the banks to dole them out and real estate developers to allow all applicants in. This gets us to redlining, the third and final segment of what I want to present to you this morning. And to answer those questions, we have to discuss the third leg of our triangle, redlining. In terms of impact upon opportunity for wealth accumulation, redlining is undoubtedly the policy source for so much of the racial wealth gap we suffer in our country today. Begun in 1934, redlining was the official Federal Housing Authority, FHA, practice for classifying neighborhoods for mortgage backing. The Homeowners Loan Coalition HOLC, was a federally funded program to help homeowners refinance their mortgages. And to help the government determine in which neighborhoods to back these loans, the HOLC created what were called, quote, residential security maps for the FHA underwriting handbook. They did so for over 200 cities all across this country. And they classified neighborhoods as such, one of four ways. They were classified as green, meaning they lacked, quote, a single foreigner or Negro, unquote. And they were supremely attractive for mortgage backing. They were classified as blue, neighborhoods that were still desirable and represented low risk for infiltration by non-whites. They were classified as yellow, neighborhoods that bordered Black neighborhoods and were considered risky. Or they were classified as red, neighborhoods that were populated by Black residents and were therefore ineligible for FHA mortgage backing. What's more, the FHA actually insisted that properties they insured use restrictive covenants. Remember, this was before the Shelley decision. Use restrictive covenants like the ones the Shelleys fought against. So when Eugene Burnett went to Long Island Levittown to see about a house, the Levitts had redlining on their mind and denied him application. Redlining as an official government policy would not be officially rescinded until the Fair Housing Act of 1968, some 2 decades after the Shelley decision. So as I wrap up on this question, and I want to make sure I give Lee time to also answer, this was just a short primer on some of the leading events that shaped the state-sanctioned segregation policies in the U.S. in the early mid to mid 20th century, and I hope this has been helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Yinka. I think that the historical perspective is really important to unpack what is an incredibly complicated issue. I feel very similar. I actually have a little presentation I'm going to give because it's so data heavy to really understand the way that these systems recalibrate themselves and manifest, in modern days. One of, to your specific question, Celeste, of what attorneys can do, what can we do as the bar right now? I think we can do a couple of things. My presentation is going to focus on evictions, and I'll hop in a moment, but we need attorneys to take up these issues, to represent individuals, not only in their larger litigation, but I find in eviction courts, particularly in this day and age, this is where the rubber meets the road for most of our community. It is the only interaction they have with the justice system outside of maybe the municipal courts. And it's difficult to do without a lawyer. So there's always an opportunity to get involved there and to volunteer, to take these cases, to make this a part of your work. To Nelson's point, this is a duty to help people. That is our charge as lawyers. And you can easily do it in the eviction courts, as I'll explain in a moment. And then I really think the other way we can use our tools as attorneys is to address the Fair Housing Act. The 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1968 Fair Housing Act, we have seen progress. It has not been enough in other areas, voting rights, school segregation, et cetera. You can point to these marked moments of change in our country. It's difficult to really do that with housing. I would argue that the promises of the 1968 Fair Housing Act have not even been close to fulfilled. And we're barely chipping away at what we could be doing with that tool. So hopefully today will open your eyes to ways that housing discrimination is happening and encourage that you look for those things and use your tool set as an attorney to really attack some of these issues. So I am going to share my screen. I want to talk about really building on that historical context of how redlining has really affected the ability of Black families in the St. Louis area to gain wealth, how that has manifested itself now as an eviction crisis in our community, and talk about it briefly in the context of COVID as well. I think I can do this in 5 minutes, but please feel free to cut me off if I'm going a little bit too long. All right, so we really are in another public health crisis right now, in addition to the COVID crisis. Evictions and family displacements were a problem in this community well before this pandemic. We know that people facing eviction, before they even lose their homes or even brought into the courts, are reporting poor health results, the litany of issues that are listed here, the psychological distress that families are put under. And then to tie it to something you're going to hear about later this afternoon or this morning, these evictions move families into environments that are not as safe, that have environmental consequences, that pull their children out of the schools that they're in right now. It really is a cascading effect when someone is facing an eviction, and it is a public health crisis. We must start calling this eviction crisis and this housing instability crisis a public health crisis to really attack it. What do the numbers look like? Well, interestingly enough, the general sense that I found in the public or even in the bar is that people think of evictions like foreclosures. But we know that they're not like foreclosures. And one of the easiest and most recent benchmarks we can point to understand that difference is the late 2000s Great Recession, where we clearly were in a foreclosure crisis and families were losing their homes because they could not afford them anymore. Well, those numbers nationally have receded. We have seen foreclosures drop from the 10 million kind of peak they were at in 2008 to 2010, substantially lower today. Of course, we're worried about it with COVID, but those numbers have remained lower. What hasn't changed since the Great Recession are our eviction filings that we see. The eviction lab at Princeton kind of tracks some of the data in this area. And between 2014 and 2016 in St. Louis, so post-recession in St. Louis City and County, we were seeing about 13,000 evictions filed every year against families in our community. Some estimates, including one at WashU, actually put that number closer to 16,000. It's very hard to get data points in this area because no one has looked at this critically and challenged the way that really racism is happening in our courts and in these legal processes. So we need data points, but we do know it's somewhere between 13 and 1,600. And then we know since March 15th of last year, that number is used. That's really kind of the understanding of when the pandemic started. There have been about 5,200 evictions filed in the city and county. So in under a year in the middle of the pandemic, we're averaging about 40% filings compared to a normal year. And I'll explain why that is and why it's a little deceptive as we move forward. So really, is this eviction problem? Is it an issue of race or is it a poverty problem? We frequently think these are people that are not paying the rent, but this is a trick question, right? Any poverty problem is inextricably a race problem. They're intertwined. You can't reduce the fact that redlining drove people out of home ownership and into renters, into becoming tenants. And so we have to look at this, and then the data really backs it up that this is a race problem and that these problems are happening, these eviction issues are happening in communities of color in St. Louis. This chart is from a report in 2017, 2018 called Dismantling the Divide that was done by a group For the Sake of All, now Health Equity Works out of WashU. We worked on this report with some others on this call. And you can see in 2016, where were the evictions filed? They were filed in areas we saw white flight, to Yinka's point, and in areas where there were restrictive covenants. In North City right here, this is where the Shelley case happened, in this area. I work with families every day that live down the street from where the Shelley case happened, where the Shelley versus Kramer house is. It's incredible to see these things remanifest themselves daily. This quote here is from a task force in 2018 by the City of St. Louis Mayor's Office. And it shows that eviction is twice as prevalent among majority Black census tracts. We know that, again, looking at this map, that's certainly clear. This map tracks the Del Mar Divide that we're all well aware of, and that's where evictions are happening in our city. and they're happening at twice the rate of those in white census tracts. I borrowed this quote from Matthew Desmond that I think is really telling, that if we incarcerate Black men, what we're doing is we're locking out Black women. And we know that data. I actually pulled some points on that this morning. Black women in America are twice as likely to be behind on their rent than any other demographic, or twice as likely as white women and white families in America. We know, particularly startling to me, from a 2013 study, that the greatest single indicator of a family facing the risk of eviction is the presence of a child in their home. This should be terrifying to all of us, that children can be a predictor to actually being evicted from your home. And again, looking at this data, looking at internal studies in the city, it's simply, you can't ignore that this is a problem in communities of color that is not facing others. We look at the disproportionate impacts during COVID. I'm going to fly through this. Black families, about a third of them are at housing instability at this moment right now. Latinx families, a fifth, and then Asian families as well, compared to white families. These are disproportionate impacts that have hit a community that has been really disproportionately impacted by the pandemic as well. And now we look at an impending eviction crisis during this moment. The CDC is now recognizing this. They have issued guidance that has suspended evictions throughout the country. There's some holes in that, but they recognize African American and Hispanic American families are disproportionately represented in evictions, and those are the same people that had to bear the brunt of this pandemic the hardest. This certainly is not a coincidence. We know eviction moratoria that we have locally and rental assistance programs that have been federal have worked. That is the reason that our eviction filing numbers are down, but they've been inadequate. We are looking at Monday in the city of St. Louis, our local eviction protections expiring, and that could potentially lead to anywhere from 600 to 1,600 in our estimates, families facing the immediate threat of eviction next week in the middle of this pandemic, where we have not truly hit a recovery point. And how will it hurt these families and hurt our community? Tenants get marked with a scarlet E. If you've been evicted, landlords don't want to rent to you again. During the pandemic, particularly, families have been put in an incredible financial burden by no fault of their own, and the debts are stacking up. None of the eviction protections federally, we have had none in the state of Missouri, and at the local level have suspended rent payments or canceled rent entirely, back rent. So there's insurmountable debt these families will be forced to deal with for years to come, to the tunes of $10,000 to $15,000 in rental arrearages for often frontline low-wage workers. And in our community, we will certainly bear the cost of this, both monetary and socioeconomic. Evictions lead to homelessness. They lead to families sleeping in their cars. They lead to families doubling up. They pull kids out of schools. They lead to neighborhood instability. These are all things that will not only affect our, again, socioeconomic, but are going to come as cost to us as a community that we'll have to deal with on the back end. And then for my last point, I can expand on these later. We have no civil right to counsel. We know that tenants do not win when they're in eviction court. 77.5% of all judgments are for landlords. In this 2012 study by WashU, 2 cases out of 6,000 were for tenants. With those disproportionate numbers of Black women primarily being in eviction court, you can see the disproportionate impact playing out. And then our laws themselves are truly set up not to deliver justice. This is not, this is much to the aggravation of people like me that work with tenants, to our judges that feel like their hands are tied and working with families going through these processes. They move incredibly fast. Our state legislature has really divested any power for local reform in this area. Tenants have no protection for retaliation from their landlord if they try to bring up things like the Fair Housing Act. Well, they may there, but things like habitability or intimidation that is happening. So quite simply, the scales of justice in this type of law you can't balance them when the law is at such an imbalance to begin with. And so what do we need? We need lawyers in court to address this. As much as we do not see a lot of success, we do know that lawyers make a tremendous impact when they work with families in eviction court. And I would end saying that, I think that is one way we can get immediately involved, but we also need to be really using our tool set to attack the policies that underline the problems I've talked about today.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that opening, and that was excellent start to this discussion. So I would like to move forward with a possible systemic ways to address the housing crisis in St. Louis and really just abroad. Do you think that land trusts would be an opportunity to create some social justice in the housing arena?
Yes, definitely. And just one point I wanted to piggyback on something Lee said, where he talked about the fact that there was no right to counsel for landlord-tenant cases, and he's absolutely right about that. There was a program that I had the privilege of participating in a few years ago called the Missouri Coalition Right to Counsel. I'm not sure if it still exists. I believe it does. But essentially what it was a coalition of various law firms across St. Louis. And they provided training to associates who were obviously working in law firms and working in the civil sector, but it provided training to associates that allowed them to become temporarily deputized to become public defenders and take cases from public defenders to really alleviate and relieve an overburdened public defender system. And so, you go through this training program, you learn some of the basics of the job, and you kind of have a paired mentor to assist you along the way. And as a result, I've got to work on, a case with someone who had been in jail at that point for 4 months without any representation, right? And so when I think about that work and I think about, how brief it was, but hopefully that it got to at least temporarily alleviate and relieve an overburdened system, I would love to see a similar call to action in the landlord-tenant crisis in the real estate sector. Lawyers being similarly trained to take on cases for those who don't have representation. Law firms in St. Louis standing up and saying, yes, we'll stand behind this and we'll put forth our associates and our lawyers and our resources to assist with these needs. So that's one thought that I had on that. That specifically with community land trusts. For those who aren't familiar, of some brief background on CLT. So essentially what community land trusts are is that they are private nonprofit corporations, organizations, if you will, that provide affordable housing and land to low income and moderate income families and individuals. So CLTs have a history that sort of dates back to the 1960s and possibly even earlier, rooted in Albany, Georgia, with Black tenant farmers who were facing, discrimination from and housing at that time, and it sort of grew from there. Essentially, the way community land trusts work is that the trust itself, it acquires vacant lands, vacant plots of land, and it develops housing on those plots, on those vacant plots of land. The land is owned and it's permanently held by the trust itself. And it's done for the purpose of benefiting the community in which it sits. Now, the community land trust can then sell that housing to, like I said, low income, moderate income families. And generally in these situations, that land is leased to the homeowners for an extended period of time. Oftentimes it's things like 99 plus years, the lease. And really the goal is to both incentivize and create both land and home ownership by individuals, particularly low income individuals who are historically and systemically excluded from home ownership. There's really sort of interesting and sort of things about community land trusts that are by design created to combat what we see as disparate and disproportionately impacted communities. So if you sell a home, so if someone who buys a home from a community land trust, if they sell a home, they generally have to sell it back either to the land trust itself.
So I'm looking for an outstanding warranty.
Or we have to sell it back to another low-income family. Generally there's a board of directors involved, which is comprised of residents of the community land trust and other public representatives as well. And so what are the benefits of the community land trust, you might be thinking? Well, there's a few. One, it frankly targets gentrification. There are low-income neighborhoods that are suffering from disinvestment from our governments, that are suffering from disinvestment from funders and from corporations and from other sources of income. And as a result of the disinvestment, they are being actively displaced and actively excluded from the very communities that they built, right? So community land trusts come into play because they help to, at a minimum, stop and hopefully to reverse that process by reinvesting and transforming and redirecting control into the hands of the actual residents of these communities. So it's about sort of taking control from these sort of outside forces that often invest in communities that they are not a part of, and it reinvests that control, replaces that control into the hands of the folks who live in these communities. Community land trusts, they also provide affordability protections. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, as a result of gentrification, we see things like skyrocketing prices in real estate, which again, then has the direct effect and direct impact of excluding and displacing those low income and moderate income families. We see things like community control resulting from community land trusts. And by that, I mean, again, and oftentimes in low income communities, we'll see outside investors who will buy buildings, who will buy buildings and not put in the resources to maintain and improve those buildings. And so they end up falling behind in their conditions. So when you have a community land trust, the members of that trust, who again are the residents of that community, get to decide how resources are invested and allocated. And because they have the control, because that power has been shifted to the community, they get to decide and indeed impact the condition of the housing in which they live. So those are some of the ways in which community land trusts have often operated. I think that one of the ways in which the housing crisis in itself is going to have to be resolved is by removing barriers to financing and funding and affordability. One of the calls to action in the Ferguson Commission report, there are several there. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Ferguson Commission report has 3 sections, one of them being opportunity to thrive. And in order to thrive as a community in St. Louis, housing is going to have to be adjusted and addressed. And so one of the ways in which that can happen is by removing barriers and funding to affordability. You could have systems where points for low income tax credit applicants are awarded in situations when those who commit to affordability periods of a certain period of time, let's say 30 plus years, when that commitment happens, that they get certain tax incentives, right? There are various financial incentives that can be put in place in order to make CLTs more palatable and more prevalent in St. Louis, but we've seen some spread of CLTs certainly nationwide in places like coastal states in Denver and Minneapolis, I believe, as well, in areas where housing has generally seen increases in pricing.
If I could just make a quick point on that too, that's such a good overview, but to tie this whole thing together, if our housing crisis isn't community led, I don't think we'll get out of it. And community land trusts are one of the tools that can be used, and we're seeing success with them to that point around the country. But we should all be, skeptical of our government, using these programs and encouraging different ways to address this crisis. To all of the points that Yinka has made, I mean, we have a history of not doing such a good job with policy in the housing arena. When that power goes back to the community, it seems to be more successful, and it really gives a lot of creativity and wiggle room to address things hyper locally in your neighborhood, in your city, in your state. And so that's just a really good overview, and I think it's important that community be lifted up in this conversation.
Thank you. Yinka, if you don't have anything to add at this point, I'm going to go on to another question.
Please, go ahead.
All right. So, go ahead, Yinka, please. No, please.
No, I'm saying go ahead. You can go on. Nothing to add to this one.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I got two questions from the participants. One I thought was really great, and I think it kind of possibly ties into the idea of community land trust. I got a question that asks, why can't St. Louis have rent control in in the immediate area?
I'm happy to take this one. Yinka, you may know a little on this as well, just from government experience, but essentially I blazed through my slides on this, but the state legislature has preempted almost any type of local control that you can have in the court world, or housing world, really. So rent control itself, there is a statute that specifically bans it in the state of Missouri. It is not something that we can get around by local municipal ordinance. And then we do have some local protections. I should at least point those out. In the city of St. Louis, we have a source of income protection, right? We have expanded the protected classes under the Civil Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, to include a local municipal ordinance that says you cannot discriminate against someone because they receive a Section 8 voucher, a source of income. That is a new protected class. There are ways that you can carve out exceptions, but really, I speak with local lawmakers about this all of the time, and any kind of creative solution we come up with, it seems that it's difficult to get around state preemption. And that is very much by design. One of the most powerful lobbying arms is the Missouri Realtors in Jeff City, and they have absolutely, they've put us at an imbalance, the tenants at an imbalance compared to property owners. It's just the reality we're in right now.
How do we go about creating a community land trust? Anyone want to take that one?
So, I don't have too much of the technical details about the specific process. I know that St. Louis already has community land trust, Beyond Housing. I believe they partner with, I think it's an organization called 24/1. I believe that's the name of the organization, but they got a community land trust that operates in St. Louis as well. So I'm sure you could check out their resources for additional detail on that, in terms of how it was formed and whatnot.
Thank you, gentlemen. My next question is, how has the COVID relief packages in regard to housing impacted our ability to advocate on behalf of the social system in St. Louis, the renters and tenants?
Well, it's been difficult. So as everyone is probably somewhat aware, there is a pool of funds for rental assistance. The last big piece of congressional legislation was in late December, and that was for $25 billion nationally in rental assistance. The city of St. Louis got about $9 million of that. St. Louis County got about $30 million of that money. And then the state has $324 million in rental assistance money. Very similar to the vaccine rollout, the state has not appropriated their large sum of money to our local municipalities, which applied to receive rental assistance on an emergency basis at this point. So those $30 million and $9 million amounts are finite right now before St. Louis City or County could request more money. And we know there are so many applications. I can't give you the exact numbers. They're a little bit privileged in conversations I've had, but we know that the minute that new rental assistance applications open up, the money will be gone. It's difficult to get it. We ask, tenants that are in dire circumstances, trying to find jobs or go back to work, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with their children at home, just like everyone else is, now to do hours of paperwork to prove that they're behind on rent and experiencing hardship. So really this idea of rental assistance is great, and it has really worked to get families caught up. I don't want to discount it. That is one of the reasons we've only seen about 5,000 eviction filings in the past year, is rental assistance has gone to families to help them stay caught up. But the system itself is difficult for a lot of people to navigate. There are elements of politics at play, like almost everything else, in terms of state funding to help localities and the way localities administer their money. It's really, and then of course, no one was in this spot before. We had no precedent or tools to use. I'm in these policy conversations all of the time, and we're building the plane while we fly it to get the money out to people. And it's been really difficult, and it's taken time. One thing that we are really lucky in St. Louis City and County to have are judges that have issued local orders to halt evictions from physically occurring here locally. That is not the case in Kansas City or throughout the rest of the state. And by doing that, they have allowed more money to get into the community and hit the streets, make it to landlords, and it's truly saved lives in this community.
And if I could add, Lee is absolutely right, and I want to add this angle. So I worked as you heard in introduction, my professional background includes my role as a senior leader at United Way of Greater St. Louis. So I got a front row seat into seeing the challenges that people in our region have with housing and rental assistance. As Lee just talked about, rental assistance is one of the most difficult things to procure. At United Way, we were raising, with the help of many of the people on this call and many people in our community, we were raising north of $70 million every year. And it was very difficult, even with all the money we raised, to get people assistance with rent control. We ran, United Way, as you may know, has a line called 211, where anybody anywhere from any phone can call for any need whatsoever, and United Way will connect them with the help. When I was there, rental assistance was just always one of the top needs in our region. And so getting the money for rental assistance is very, very difficult. What I propose, and this is why I think it's important, and when I was approached to be part of this, I was so passionate about the education of us as attorneys on the history of segregation, because the history informs the present. And this is where there's an intersectionality between the history and rent control. I think we should, yes, we should work on I mean, not rent control, but rental assistance. Yes, we should work on rental assistance, but we should ultimately work to make housing, home ownership, not home rental, home ownership, more accessible to Americans broadly and people of color. Specifically, home ownership in this country, by and large, for the majority of the lion's shares of Americans living in this country, home ownership is the means to wealth. When we talk about the wealth gap in this country, much of that is attributed to the lack of home ownership amongst African Americans and other people of color in our country. So yes, rental assistance, but home ownership. And so, you know, we've got to look at things like there's a new initiative called the FAMSTL, the FAMSTL.com. check it out. It's a great new organization, but the idea is that it helps people of color, African Americans in the St. Louis region, get access to home ownership so that they don't have to worry about rental assistance. And so I think as attorneys, the more we can learn about the roadblocks to home ownership, the more we can help abolish this problem. Let me end with this. In this country, and I think it was either Lee or Nelson who talked about the morphing. Discrimination and segregation is morphed. After the abolishment of slavery, there were exclusionary zoning laws. These were the precursors to restrictive covenants. Exclusionary zoning laws basically set, and these were state sanctioned, where a locale like New Orleans or St. Louis or Alabama could say, hey, you can't sell any of these homes to people of color. You can't do it. And it was state sanctioned. This was not these weren't private entities contracting like the restrictive covenants. This was state sanctioned. And in 1917, the Supreme Court ruled them unconstitutional in a case called Buchanan v. Worley. That's 245 U.S. 60. Very important case. So what happened after that? Then you had restrictive covenants. And so because of restrictive covenants, then you had people like the Shelleys who had a hard time buying. And and then there was a case called Corrigan v. Buckley, 271 U.S. 323. That was a 1926 case from Washington, D.C. that allowed restrictive covenants on multiple properties in Washington, D.C. And so because of that case, you had the proliferation of restrictive covenants, so much so that according to a report called Understanding Fair Housing by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, 80% of neighborhoods in 1937, 80% of neighborhoods in Chicago and Los Angeles carried racial restrictive covenants by 1940. Unbelievable. And so this thing keeps morphing. What we can do to head it off is create pathways to home ownership. I'll pause there.
And the last comment I would just say, I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but related to this is I think we got to talk about student loans. I mean, one of the biggest barriers to getting a home loan is debt. I'm in the process of right now buying a house. Hopefully within 8 days I'll be closing. Like many of you, I've got plenty of student loan debt, and the barrier to getting a loan that debt has posed has been incredibly shocking. And so when we take that and we magnify that among all of the individuals in our communities of color in particular that we know are most severely impacted by student loan debt, it's not going to be enough just to make housing accessible if then at the end of the day they also can't afford it. And so there are so many different barriers that impact housing and access to housing that I think we almost have to address it from a holistic viewpoint.
Excellent point. I absolutely agree that if you have the debt, then you can't get in the house, and then you can't get in the house, you can't have the security, and you can't build wealth. I don't know right now, somebody needs to tell me if we have time for another question or if we need to move on to the next session.
Officially, we have to move on to the next session. This is a 5-minute comfort break, so we can continue if we would like, and anybody that needs to step away for a moment can come back in about 5 minutes for the next session.
Thank you, Alex. So I think we'll just go ahead and take a break. I want to, but quickly just say, I want to thank our panelists for the housing discussion, Lee, Yinka, and Nelson. You guys, donated your time and made this panel, elevated it in a discussion that I, really am pleased to say I was a part of. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And please, if you have the time, hang out a little bit and listen to the rest of the panel, because you may see some folks and you may be able to ask some questions that you need answers to. So thank you, and we're going to go ahead and take this 5 minutes before we transition to the next session.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
See you at 9:55.
All right, I think we're gonna move forward with the next panel. I've been charged with the honor of introducing these amazing women for the education session, which Malini Rao will be moderating for us. We have Dr. Renee Racette, who has devoted her professional career to our St. Louis children in the educational system, from frontline teacher to now being the creator of Navigate Schools, an organization devoted to addressing systemic racism and creating justice in the school system. We also have with us Adelaide Lancaster, who is also an advocate for social justice in education. She has created We Stories, a program that supports children and their families in navigating important issues such as racism in school setting. And finally, we have Dr. Furtado, a data and research expert working with Forward Through Ferguson, an initiative to address the intersection of race, racism, and health in the public school system. So I'm gonna toss it over to you now, Malini. Thank you very much and look forward to the discussion.
Everyone, so it's actually Fran Barbieri who's moderating this panel.
I apologize.
That's okay. I know there's a lot of names here to keep track of. So thanks everyone for joining us. To kick us off, we're going to start with Karishma Furtado. And Karishma, now you took a deep dive into the data around school funding, race, and allocation of resources in the area in a study that was published called Still Separate, Still Unequal. And I will be posting the link to that study in the chat. I encourage everyone to take a look at it. It's fascinating, it's heartbreaking. Karishma, could you share with us a summary of your findings?
Absolutely. Let me share my screen with you all so you can follow along. Can everyone see that? Well, hearing nothing, assume yes. Perfect. Well, let's jump right into it. I'm so glad to be with you all this morning. I know we have a lot to get through, so let's do it. Beginning with just a little bit more about Forward Through Ferguson to provide some context. As you may know, the work of Forward Through Ferguson began with the Ferguson Commission, the 16 community members who were brought together by the governor after the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. The commission confronted the community pain that the region experienced in the uprising that followed that killing and engaged with it by naming the underlying root causes. Incorporating the insights of over 3,000 community members contributing over 30,000 volunteer hours, the commission process made clear that for decades, our siloed systems had allowed and were still allowing racial equity to fall through the cracks. The commission produced nearly 200 policy calls to action to start changing those systems. And that's a lot, we know. Another way to look at it is as one core call to action. Deal with the St. Louis region's systemic racial inequities. Here are 189 first steps. Forward Through Ferguson was born at the end of the commission out of a vocal community desire that the momentum amassed continue to ensure that the report didn't gather dust on a shelf. We've applied that charge to the education space now for several years because we, like many, believe in the power of education as perhaps the best guarantee of lifelong well-being, prosperity, and success for all. It's also essential for thriving societies. My cat's going to join us, looks like. But as we're constantly reminded, the benefits of education are not equally distributed. The achievement gap, the learning gap, the discipline gap, our education landscape is littered with evidence of, sorry, I'm gonna get rid of this cat, evidence of how Black students tend to perform worse than their white classmates. These cracks are so deep and persistent that they've become, for many, permanent disfigurations on our education topography, despite many efforts and a lot of resources to close them. We assert that those past efforts largely failed because they didn't engage with the sources of the outcome disparities, the structure of our education system. We further assert that our education system is doing exactly what it was built to do, affording better opportunities to white, wealthy students at the expense of poor Black students. The Still Separate, Still Unequal tool intentionally shifts attention upstream, away from glaring outcome disparities and towards some of the structural barriers that make those disparities nearly inevitable. This tool is organized into investigations of 4 interrelated structural barriers that you see here on the screen. These are obviously not all the structural barriers in our education system, nor are they, is this a definitive explanation of the causal linkages between each barrier. But it's a start, a call for us to see the system that produces the outcomes that we're all too familiar with. So, what did we find? At every step in the path upstream, we found systemic barriers to education equity. I'll share with you just some top-line findings from the tool, and we'll start with a structural barrier that's most proximal to outcome disparities, the education environment. So, why might we see entrenched racial differences in academic performance? One likely contributor is that the education environment in majority Black districts tends to be different than that in majority white districts. We looked at indicators of education environment quality in 4 categories, and in most ways, majority Black school districts performed worse across these categories. For example, teachers in majority Black districts were paid over $6,000 less on average and were 4.7 times more likely to be in their first year of teaching, which is important because that first year of teaching is where we see the highest rates of attrition, departure from the field, and that's very disruptive to students who lose their teacher mid-year. These differences in staff compensation and qualification contribute in turn to course offering differences. So for example, majority white school districts were 3 times more likely to offer advanced placement courses, and while 43% of majority Black districts didn't offer calculus. Not a single majority white school district failed to offer that course. So why are education environments different in majority Black districts versus majority white districts? Partly because majority white districts are more likely to have the funding to pay for environments rich in
Already it's been an extremely busy morning for me. I am on
Hope Whitehead. Hope Whitehead, you are cutting into our Zoom. Can you please mute yourself? Thank you, please.
So, partly because majority white districts are more likely to have the funding to pay for environments rich in opportunity. We found that the St. Louis region's education funding landscape is highly uneven and that it's not an accident. Theoretically, state funding, allocated through the foundation formula, should make up for local funding differences. But our state foundation formula systematically falls short of filling funding shortfalls, and thanks to features within it, like the hold harmless provisions, actually disproportionately benefits small and/or property wealthy districts. Partly as a result, we see this. On average, majority white districts receive more funding per student than majority Black districts, about $1,700 more per student. Wealthy white districts also tend to get a lot more of their funding from local sources. So overall, funding for education varies widely across the Tri-County region, despite a state funding model that's intended to even things out. That variability is driven in turn by funding variations at the local level. So let's look there next. The fact of the matter is that directly funding education through property taxes is inequitable. The property in majority white districts is vastly more valuable than in majority Black districts. The median assessed property value for majority Black districts is about $98,000 per student. For majority white districts, it's about 2 times higher at $182,000. And that means that wealthy white districts can raise enough money without taxing themselves as much as property poorer districts. And that's what we see in this scatter plot at the bottom right here. This is a graph of median household income or wealth on the x-axis and tax rate ceiling, or the maximum tax a district can levy per voter approval on the y-axis. So what we see here is this negative relationship. The districts with the highest household income, the greatest wealth, are taxing themselves the least. And conversely, the districts where we see the lowest wealth are voting to tax themselves the most, to try to bridge this gap in what their students need. But their property is simply not valuable enough to come anywhere close to actually fully closing that gap. So perhaps at this point, you're reflecting on why valuable property is where it is, what was there before it, and why there are so many fewer such valuable businesses and homes in majority Black districts. Let's make our last stop upstream, segregation. So what led to these patterns of concentrated wealth and whiteness and vice versa? It's a complicated set of dynamics, but in some ways the answer is as simple as this. Historical federal, state, and local policies made it exceedingly difficult for Black families to obtain property, and when they did, if that property became too valuable, local forces used their authority and power to take it. From the FHA program that built the white American middle class, to the interstate system as a tool for separating Black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods, to land development initiatives that paved around or right over Black neighborhoods, much of which I imagine you spoke of in your previous session, our history is rich with overtly racist policies that preferentially enriched white individuals and families. Race-neutral policies that eventually replaced those overtly racist policies did little to nothing to correct for the segregation that by that point had already taken root. Schools have been part and parcel of those dynamics. For the most part, our schools have grown more segregated over the past 30 years. This graph shows segregation or dissimilarity index scores for the region based on public school districts. In 2019, the Tri-County Dissimilarity Index score, which is the blue line, was 0.71. By comparison, in 1968, which was after Brown v. Board ruled segregated schools unconstitutional, but before most districts had actually moved to integrate, the dissimilarity index nationwide was 0.8. So today, our region schools are almost as segregated as the nation's schools were before meaningful integration took place. So this was a very, very quick look at some of our findings, and we hope that you'll check out the full tool. Thank you, Fran, for dropping that link in the chat. However, after just that quick trip upstream, I hope three things are becoming clear. One, at every step in our journey, we found systemic barriers to education equity. Two, this isn't an accident, it's by design. And three, those structural barriers in our education system make the outcome disparities nearly inevitable. Understanding the deep brokenness of our system is the first step to intentionally changing it. So let me just briefly talk about what those next steps are. One of our favorite sayings is that diagnosis determines treatment. When we look at education disparities and make a diagnosis about individual failure of Black kids that aren't trying hard enough, of parents that don't care, we develop one set of treatments that try to increase parent engagement or that try to identify the kids with exceptional potential or grit. When we make a diagnosis of systems drivers that stack the deck against marginalized students, we come up with a whole different set of interventions. What do those interventions look like? On the state level, we're talking about potential legal and policy targets like changing the foundation formula, which is the way, again, that the state funds education. And our current foundation formula is rife with facets that make it systemically unequal that I very briefly touched on, things like the hold harmless provisions. We're also talking about things like strengthening the state constitution's almost uniquely weak commitment to education. We're also thinking about things like shifting property tax models of funding education to models that we know are more equitable. We're also talking about reworking the state education standards programs. That's MSIP. Those statewide wins will require regional organizing and capacity growth by growing partnerships across districts and across sectors, building equity-based infrastructure like the equity indicators, and creating the education design and finance task force to bring people together to think about what education transformation should look like. And achieving those regional goals will require growing understanding of systems change and racial equity, establishing common definitions and visions of racial equity within education, and building power and agency of stakeholders of all sorts, including like yourselves. So I'll wrap up there. I know there's more good stuff coming down the pike in this session, and looking forward to being a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Karishma. So I have some exciting news. Congresswoman Cori Bush is here, and we are so thankful that she was able to make time from her schedule. I think, as you know, Congresswoman, we have a couple hundred lawyers from the St. Louis area here on the line. So Karishma was just wrapping up a deep dive into the St. Louis area, and how race has played a part in educational inequality. And I think that you were also going to speak in a similar vein about systemic racism and systemic changes and some legislative proposals that you have brewing. So I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, well, thank you, and good, what is it, still morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this invite. I'm absolutely honored, and just thank you for thinking of me and the work that we are trying to do in Congress, and what I'm trying to do along with so many others to be able to affect change right where we live. So again, I'm Congresswoman Cori Bush, and I represent the amazing Missouri's 1st District, which is St. Louis. Thank you right now. Let me just put it out there to the countless organizers who have made this remarkable event possible. Kudos to you. Your tireless labor has not gone unnoticed. It is such a privilege to have this conversation with you all. And I know that some folks in the audience were out in the streets of Ferguson with me. And for that, being on here with you, I am forever grateful. You know, everything that I do for St. Louis. So I want to start by talking about St. Louis. It is the place that raised me. It is the place that I love and the place that loved me. It is the place that accepted me. It is the place that taught me. It's the place that struggled with me. It's the place that will forever and always be home. 100% the place that I love. St. Louis also struggles under the weight of crime and community violence because of poverty and decades-long policies that have left our neighborhoods under-resourced and underserved. St. Louis leads the nation in police killings again and again and again, a heartbreaking and gut-wrenching reality that must be solved urgently and holistically. We are living in the tragic aftermath of the murder of Michael Brown Jr. Over 6 years ago, our community was devastated by his loss. In Michael, people saw themselves, their child, their sibling, their friend. We took to the streets to demand change. For over 400 days, we protested, demanding justice. We were tear gassed and physically assaulted. Oh, the violence by law enforcement. We were stomped on by police officers. I was one of those people. We saw our friends and our neighbors arrested and violence unleashed in our streets as law enforcement and white supremacist those terror groups swarmed into Ferguson in 2014. We watched our loved ones die as a result of gun violence and police violence. And we have grieved with our community as our friends, family members, and our neighbors became survivors of crime, violence, and police brutality. I love St. Louis. And it was out of this love that we kept going and we kept showing up. We love our community so deeply that we cared that Mike got justice, that everyone who showed up that night not only got home okay, but had what they needed to be okay the next day, that our community could heal. We did that day after day, night after night. And I knew that as a nurse, as a mental health care practitioner, and as a pastor, I could help provide that care, whether it be physical, mental, or spiritual. In the streets of Ferguson, in my church, and in my community, we started to reimagine this country. We started to reimagine an America that loved humanity. How about that? An America that cared for its communities. We came to believe deeply that we can remove police officers and metal detectors from our schools and invest in more nurses and guidance counselors. That we can fund housing and community-based services rather than criminalizing sex workers. Like, what? Criminalizing the unhoused and those with that suffer from mental illness and chronic and substance use disorders. We knew it was possible because we saw wealthy communities afforded these opportunities. We saw the ways in which investment in schools and in healthcare facilities led to a more vibrant quality of life. We knew it was possible. When my community called upon me to run for office, I said no. I said no because I had always said I'd never run for office. Watching my father, who's been a politician for most of my life, I saw the greed and the corruption. I saw a soul give so much to the community, and I saw all the pain come back to him. So I said no. But then when my community asked again and again, I thought about my family, my 2 children. And I realized that if anything ever happened to them and I had not done everything I could within my power to make sure that they were safe, I would not be able to live with myself. So I ran. But I didn't run alone. We ran. A deep coalition of organizers and activists and loved ones who believed in a new vision for our community. We ran with the support of young people who fought every day to be heard and to make their mark on the world. And when we took our seat in Congress, we took it not as a politician, but as a politivist. I say it all the time. I'm a politician and an activist. Activism informs each and every demand we make for our community in Congress, which means the marching, organizing, and activism continues. It also means that we will continue to lead with radical love and compassion in partnership with my fellow committee members to ensure that we reduce harm and dismantle systemic and racial injustice in our country. Our path to freedom requires that we work in partnership with every social movement to help usher in change that is so desperately needed in our institutions. But to do that work effectively and in pursuit of justice, real justice, we have to first acknowledge the limitations of our institutions and also see our role in the fight for liberation in an honest and clear way. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to leave the law. Not saying that. You don't have to throw your hands up in the air in despair. As much as we want to do that sometimes, we know that our work within these institutions is crucial. You are there. You have work that others can't do. As an organizer, I relied heavily on legal hotlines and pro bono attorneys who supported and protected those of us on the front lines. As an activist, I worked alongside movement lawyers who were committed to using the law in service of a broader call to action. Time and time again, attorneys, judges, academics, and legal practitioners across the country helped us to challenge the unlawful practices of law enforcement or corrupt politicians, and to shift the power balance between everyday people demanding change and a government that often seemed committed to suppressing our voices. Your role is central in our fight. Even on days when it feels disheartening, know that your Congresswoman loves you, that she is grateful for your work and your heart. I am grateful. And remember, your work is just when it isn't grounded in love, when it is grounded in justice, when it is grounded in compassion, it is just. My job in Congress is to channel the will of the social movements that made me who I am and secured us this seat. That means ensuring that every legislative action is backed by and created in partnership with grassroots organizers, that it meets the demands of the movement, that I am held accountable by a broad coalition of people who organize in St. Louis for justice. And for you, I imagine the task is similar. Your role is to protect those that are victims and survivors of violence, pain, and the trauma of white supremacy. You are equipped with the legal tools to protect protesters who are criminalized, wrongly detained, and entangled in our court systems. You defend those individuals in our criminal legal system who are neglected and shoved into a punitive system with limited mercy. You lead, national litigation in defense of our rights and our freedoms. Your work is valuable, and even more so when it aligns with the demands of our movement and the people closest to the issue. Our work has to reflect the work of those most impacted, most criminalized, and most traumatized by white supremacy. Now, we have a seat. We do. We have a seat on the House Judiciary Committee, and we will use every tool at our disposal to support the people most impacted by a punitive legal system. We will center the experiences of those serving overly harsh sentences behind bars, those whose families have been shattered by a criminal system that cares more about punishment than rehabilitation. Last month, I led my colleagues in a call of action to President Biden, urging him to commute the sentences of the 49 people on federal death row. In a just society, the death penalty would not exist. We must do the most for those who have the least, and ending this barbaric practice. That would be an important step forward. It is for this reason that one of our first calls to action was around clemency and ensuring that we decarcerate our prisons as soon as possible. This call to action is particularly important amidst a raging pandemic that is making its way through our nation's prisons and jails, including those in Missouri. 2 weeks ago, following an uprising at the City Justice Center, right in St. Louis, we wrote to the mayor of St. Louis and requested full transparency and human rights protections for the men incarcerated at the jail. Like so many communities across this nation, St. Louis needs us to champion a public safety agenda that puts humanity over greed and justice over violence and righteousness over power. We did this after meeting with organizers and public defenders and also impacted community members who were doing the deep work of fighting for the rights of their community, and also with family members who are being incarcerated in unsafe conditions during this pandemic. My being here today as a representative for St. Louis, it's not an accident. My office, our office, is a testament to the power of our movement and our demands. This Congress and this administration present an opportunity for us to hit the ground running, y'all, in pursuit of our goals. We must meet this moment with open minds and open ideas and open hearts. We need to be bold. Are you bold? We need to be bold and unapologetic, ambitious and unrelenting, because the status quo will not be dismantled easily. We have called to defund the police, end mass incarceration, and stop the surveillance of our communities. Despite the demands, despite the marching in our streets, our prison and jail populations are rising. We know that our unhoused and our trans communities are still being criminalized, and our children continue to die at the hands of gun violence and police violence. We know all of this. So the urgency to respond to these crises cannot be understated. It's our work, you all. They may laugh at us. They may ridicule us. They may label us radicals, but there's nothing funny or radical about saving lives. That's our work. We are saving lives. Our demands for justice and accountability are justified. Our safety and our freedom will no longer be denied.
Corey, thank you so much for appearing. We really are, honored to have you joining us this morning. We'd really like to hear your ideas regarding educational justice. The members on your particular panel are, you basically have careers dedicated to social justice in the field of education. And we'd love to hear your thoughts as a legislator on that issue.
Oh, okay. All right. On education. So, I'm not sure which vein you want me to necessarily go down, but yeah, I have been a proponent for definitely for the dismantling the school to prison pipeline. And so, but one way that we start with that, pushing for, so let me just say right now in Congress, it's not happening. everything that we're doing as it relates to education. When we're talking about dismantling the school to prison pipeline, we have been doing the deep work and talking with our colleagues, but right now legislation is not up front. It's not something that we're trying to get that will be done by April, even though I wish that it was. So what we're doing is working on looking at dismantling the, let me see, how can I put this in a way to, let's see, trying to figure out how to, can you tighten it up a little bit? Maybe that'll help me to kind of, because the work that we're doing right now is we're looking at how mass incarceration and how just our environment, how environmental injustice, all of that plays a role in our fight to better our education system as it relates to like adding funding to education when we defund the police, adding money to mental health, putting more nurses and more counselors in our school systems, not closing our schools. So putting funding and more resources to be able to make sure that we have teachers who represent the communities that that they're serving in, putting money into programs to be able to create, give the ability for more teachers, giving money to HBCUs and MSIs. So, I mean, it's kind of broad. If you could kind of tighten it up a little bit, I can kind of hit on exactly what you want me to.
Well, actually,
we like all of your ideas, and we just wanted to hear from a legislative perspective how you think that we can attack the social injustices in the education. We're really, what you're talking to is a group of attorneys. And so as legal advocates, we want, direction, support, ideas about how to move educational justice forward in St. Louis.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I've been working with my colleagues in Congress, to eliminate the $1.6 trillion in college debt. And so when we're talking about, that's of course talking about, college, but that is something that is on the forefront of our minds. That also deals with closing the racial wage gap and closing the gender wage gap. We know that Black women carry the most, student debt than anyone in the country, but Black women carry more than anyone. We're the group that carries the most. So we're working to eliminate that. Investing in K through 12. So we believe in, regardless of the zip code, which I know that many of you probably feel the same, investing that quality, investing resources directly that will come from defunding the police, putting that money into education. And in speaking about that,
I'm so sorry, Congresswoman, your staff is blowing up my phone. You have something to get to. I'm so sorry. Do you have one more thing? I mean, you can talk all you want about how lawyers can get involved, but I just want to let you know they're blowing up my phone.
Okay. One thing that we have been doing is supporting increases in wages for our school teachers. $60,000. It should be the start. It should be the floor for our school teachers. Let me see what else. Closing the ratio in our classrooms is going to be important. That's something that we have to do right now. And I know that that we don't have a lot of legislation around that right now, but that is something that we are committed to. And also we're committed to free graduate school for our lawyers and our doctors and our social workers and MBAs who commit to careers in the public sector for 10 years. So those are just some of the things that we have that we're working on, and maybe you all can partner with us on that. Also, lastly, I know I gotta go, but high school reform. If we don't, we have to incentivize certificate programs so we can train up skilled workers and without college degrees. And I know that we want to have everybody go to college, but we have students who feel like that's not their road. And so making sure that we open up the resources in our schools to not only, we used to have, more resources except for, right now we only have it in two schools in the St. Louis area where you can learn the skills and be able to start a job right out of high school. So we need to increase that. We need to incentivize schools that are doing that. So that's part of it. And then remember the second chance Pell Grants for HBCUs. If you all could work with us on that, that would be great. I know I got to go, but those are a few of the things.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A message from the president. I'll forward that. Thank you, Congresswoman Bliss, from John Gunn. I appreciate that. Moving on to our other experts then on the panel.
So as we've heard, I think a theme of educational reform is going to depend a lot on funding. And I'm seeing some questions in the chat on funding. And we have here an expert to talk to us about alternative methods of funding our schools. So Renee, can you please tell us about the concept of evidence-based funding, what that means, and whether that might be a solution for Missouri?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I'm going to be able to draw a thread from Karishma's talk through the call to action that we just heard from Corey Bush. And so I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Get this going. All right, there we go. We should be all set. So you all are seeing this? We're good to go? Awesome. All right, so my name is Renee Racette. I spent 13 years in the St. Louis Public Schools. I was a chemistry teacher. I was a principal. I also earned a PhD in the field of critical race theory, which actually came from the legal frame, critical legal studies. So before I dive into evidence-based funding, I want to provide some scaffolding because I think critical race theory developed the ire of our former president for a very particular reason, and is because it can serve as an antidote to the systems that have been baked in white supremacy and how they are impacting us, even if they on their face might seem race neutral. So I'm going to start with just a quick primer on critical race theory. As I mentioned, it came out of critical legal studies. Derek Bell is considered one of the pioneers in this field. There's a few other names here in the pre-work materials that you received. I've included a bunch of journal articles and links. So if you do have some interest in critical race theory, I would love for you to, really broaden your ability to understand it. It was applied to education by Gloria Latson Billings and William F. Tate in 1995. And it really tells us four main things. The first is that racism is permanent, it is normalized, and it holds huge influence in American society. Second, that storytelling is the preferred method to expose racism because it honors the perspective of the oppressed individual. The people at the margins who are experiencing the oppression are the ones that you center through storytelling. It also really critiques liberalism because it is showing that liberalism actually has been perpetuating racism. The liberal policies that we have enacted over the years have not actually gotten us any closer to a society that is truly egalitarian. And that ultimately the main benefactors of most civil rights legislation, as Karishma highlighted with the Federal Housing Act and other things, have actually benefited white folks. And Derek Bell coined this term as interest convergence, meaning that policy is going to tend to converge on a white benefit as opposed to an intentional disruption of that benefit and for the folks that are on the margins. CRT also demands that radical action be taken. We cannot tinker ourselves to utopia. We cannot incrementally change a system that was designed as intentionally unequal. And so it does require us to think pretty radically about how we are proposing policy solutions and taking actions. So as I mentioned, white supremacy has really been our dominant policy and sort of influence, and that you as folks in positions of influence in law and policy can bring awareness to how racism, white supremacy, and interest convergence have been baked into the systems of law and policy. It might show up in your workplace as well. And then, as I mentioned, we cannot tweak our way out of this situation to liberation. We've got to take some bold, really radical action in order to get to the desired state. So as mentioned, I wanted to highlight a case study. I was able to spend and do a fellowship at the Illinois State Board of Education. And while I was there, I got to witness a policy called evidence-based funding and witness how it was being brought into action. So just a little bit of background first on what evidence-based funding was. This was signed into law by the Illinois governor in August of 2017. And it comprehensively changed how Illinois funds schools and school districts. In essence, it is sending more resources to the districts that have more underserved students and who have more needs. Evidence-based funding demonstrates that we need new mindsets for how to understand the relationship between equity, adequacy, and student success. What we know and what ISB was pretty inspiring to me is that as a state agency, it acknowledges that racism exists. It acknowledges that the system has been inherently unequal and that it is saying we need to do something very radically different in order to close those gaps. So getting into a little bit more detail here. So all of the Illinois districts were analyzed with over 30 different points of data, ranging from things like how many English language students are there in the district? What is the current tax base? What's the assessed valuation of land? What's the average wage index? To develop an adequacy target for every district. So essentially this was saying, how much money does this district need to adequately educate its students based on how much revenue the district can generate, based on what sort of students the district is serving, and based on the local sort of labor market data. What they then found after this analysis was a huge range. Again, as Karishma showed us in her presentation, funding formulas are inherently unequal because they are rooted in, property tax value and where a district is located. And we know that wider districts tend to be wealthier. We know that they tend to have a higher tax base. So what they found in Illinois was a range from 42% of adequate, meaning they are less than half funded to what they need, to districts that had over 280% of adequate funding, right? So that was the range that they found in Illinois. Less than half of what they needed to over 2.5 times what they needed, right? That's systemic inequity in action. That is white supremacy in action. The state then did something really radical, and it said that in order to change that and in order to shift that gap, we need to give more funding to the districts that need it most. So they divided all of those school districts into tiers based upon how much distance they had to get to adequacy. And then they actually did just that. 50% of the total allocation from the state legislature went to those districts furthest from their target, right? So half of the money was going to the districts furthest away. 49% of funding then went to the districts in that second tier who were still really far from adequacy, but again, not nearly where they needed to be. And then for districts who were at or approaching adequacy or above adequacy, then you see with tiers 2, 3, and 4, they got a minuscule amount of funding compared to what was given to the whole. So again, you see, this is a very intentional effort by the state legislature, by the state education agency to say, the policy was written inherently unequally, and we need to remedy that by giving different districts different amounts of funding in order to help bringing up those far from adequacy and really giving the additional resources where they were needed most. So I went through that really quickly because I know we're sort of a little bit crunched on time, and I will just close out there, and I know we've got questions coming in the end.
So I think, you have shared this great data about what Illinois did, which is fascinating. And Karishma also at the end of her presentation kind of outlined some steps that might be able to get to greater educational equity. And what I'd like to turn to now is like concrete ways that St. Louis area lawyers can get involved. And I see that the Missouri Bar President, John Gunn, in the comments just posted some information about some volunteer opportunities that should be coming out that will get to these concepts. So that's great. Take a look at that. And then also I'd like to turn to our other panelists to talk about this. So I'm going to go to Adelaide next. Adelaide, can you share any opportunities for people, especially lawyers, to get involved in just discussions about solutions or other ways to get plugged in with like-minded people?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Hi, everyone. This has been such a rich discussion so far. I think the place that my work really comes forward and where I see the greatest opportunity is, really like in your personal lives, in your civic spheres, where you show up in where you live, in your neighborhood, organizations that you touch. How can you bring your skill set, your knowledge as attorneys, and how can you leverage that in the places where change is most likely to happen? So as has been laid out by the experts so far and our Congresswoman, the change to get to state level, the work that needs to happen to get to state level change is immense. And the bedrock of that is really about shifting a lot of people's mindsets and helping them understand where these issues come into play, where they live, where they work, where they send their children to school. So I can say from where I sit in the St. Louis region, trying to raise consciousness in a predominantly white, wealthy district about our level of funding adequacy and the things that we do here to try to increase our funding, even though our region overall is extremely disparate, as we've heard. Shifting those mindsets so that parents and individuals and voters on the very hyper local level can be making different choices that are beginning to prioritize the well-being of all children, not necessarily just our children. So as Renee was just highlighting for us, that interest convergence is really strong. The way the system is designed, and there's lots of amazing comments and questions in the chat, like who's designing it? How does it get to be this way? There are real and complicated answers to that. But the question really is like, who continues perpetuating it to be the way that it is? And for the most part, it's us. It's everybody on this call in some way or another. And so I really encourage you to be looking about where to get active in the spaces that you already exist and have some influence. So that may be the district where you live, the communities that you live. We have 90-something charter or, municipalities in our area. Everyone has a different charter, and your knowledge as attorneys and ability to look at the past legal horizon and be able to anticipate the future legal horizon and the impacts of policy change over time is incredibly important to supporting small organizations like the one I run, to supporting activists and organizers like Congresswoman Bush before she was in office. We really need your support and help in a lot of the everyday parsing of what is, how did it get to be this way, and where are there opportunities for small shift and engagement.
Thank you. While we have your attention, Adelaide, I just wanted you to spend a couple of minutes talking about We Stories. So I think, as we all know, another huge facet of education, and particularly racial justice education, is definitely taught at home. So can you tell us just for like a 1-minute overview?
Yeah, sure. So the organization I run is called We Stories, and essentially what we do is to help families, predominantly white families and white parents, become comfortable talking about race and racism within the family context. So we know that white parents in particular are significant drivers of maintaining the policies that we have, which holds the inequity and disparity that we have broadly in place. We also know that racial bias begins to cement by the age 7. And these are not years where we are talking to young kids about, systemically in our schools, in our communities, about racial difference, discrimination, and bias. And so we provide families, communities, and schools with the tools to begin to open up that conversation so that, learning more along the lines of what Karishma shared and Renee shared as time goes on allows a readier audience for the hard policy change you know, when we get there.
I think, you know, we're seeing questions in the chat about how to address these issues on a systemic level. It feels overwhelming, and I think that that's part of getting there is to educate our kids. Another question about how to attack this seemingly insurmountable problem. So, Renee, do you have any thoughts on how to get rural lawmakers on board, or just any lawmakers that might be predisposed to be opposed to evidence-based funding?
Yeah, I would venture to guess that their districts are not adequately funded either, right? This is a situation where we have common problems, and I think it's reaching across the aisle and saying things like, you know, do you have universal Wi-Fi for your students, you know, on snow days? You know, how has your district been navigating COVID? Were your students able to learn from home? Is there broadband? I mean, I think it's trying to figure out how white supremacy in policy influences rural communities and rural legislators, and then saying we can attack it. The problem looks different in our communities, but ultimately it's from the same vein of white supremacist, you know, policy.
And to just piggyback off that, Renee, if you don't mind, Fran, the current foundation formula that we have was put in place in about 2006. It came as the result of successful legal action taken against the previous foundation formula, which was actually worse. So what we have is an improvement, though certainly not what we need for equitable and high quality education for all of our students. But what I want to point out is that that legal action, Committee for Educational Equality v. State of Missouri, was the product of a coalition of in-state, out-state, urban and rural school districts coming together. So we've done this before. We'll have to do something like that again. You're absolutely right, Renee, that the inequities in the foundation formula that disadvantage Black poor kids in St. Louis are also not doing any favors for poor white kids in rural Missouri for the most part. And there's an opportunity, again, tying back to that interest convergence and the, you know, if we flip that as an opportunity, where can we look for the alignment between our platforms and use that to broaden our reach and our efficacy.
So this is probably for you, Karishma, and maybe Adelaide, but when you guys, you know, published the Still Unequal study, did you have any vision as to how those results should be used or who you'd love to read it? You know, just what's the ultimate goal that you guys see?
Yeah, I mean, it might be an unsatisfying answer, but like, I really think everyone needs to read it, and not just because I wrote it. No, but I think that what we're talking about here, when we're talking about things like changing the state constitution, changing the foundation formula, these are massive policy targets. They're not going to happen tomorrow. They're not going to happen next week. We're talking about the slow burn of a movement here. We've got like good examples of what that looks like in Georgia, in Arizona. Those are a decade worth of organizing to change the tenor of a state, you know. I think what we're talking about is more of that magnitude, and that does not mean that work doesn't happen tomorrow and the day after and every one of the days between now and years from now. So I think it's really, to plug back into what I was seeing in the chat about growing the capacity of stakeholders in all the nooks and crannies of our ecosystem, including legal scholars and practitioners like yourselves, to understand what applied racial equity means, what systems change means, so that we can start pushing this big, heavy weight of systemic racism forward and breaking it down. Yeah, so I really think it's incumbent upon individuals in all their spheres of influence to start thinking about this and growing their capacity. It's not a quick or easy thing.
Yeah, I mean, the common theme here seems to be that the first steps really start with the people you already know, the organizations we're already involved in, and it's not as it's not like you have to run out and, like, you know, become an officer in a new organization or do something that's totally outside of your comfort zone, which is great. I think it's a good call to action for us. Our time is just about up. Do any of you have any kind of parting thoughts? And I will say that there, in the packet that was emailed to you, there are some great links about evidence-based funding. There is a link to a sample bill that could be used for other states. So definitely check those out, as well as the Still Unequal study. But I'll turn it back to you guys for any final words.
I just want to uplift the comment in the chat that one direct way we can start practicing and flexing our muscles in this space is with school board elections that are coming up and that, you know, come up regularly. School boards have a tremendous amount of power. A lot of power is left to the local district level in our education structure. So putting operationalized commitments to racial equity into action often starts with those school boards, with superintendents, and we can ask the right questions. We brainstormed some in the chat to start ensuring that those policymakers have the right heart set mindset for this work. Elizabeth Graham Howell, I'm going to try to drop a link to, Elizabeth asked about whether there are any states that have abolished property taxes. I don't know of any that have abolished it to fund schools, but there are definitely states and spaces that have implemented different models for collecting and redistributing property taxes that are more equitable. So I'm going to drop a link to a report and tool that simulates that in the chat. Let me find it.
So I would just echo that and say, in addition to digging deeper in the resources that have been provided, really identifying the district that is closest to you or that you may already be involved in with your family, and figuring out what's going on. Who are the local organizations? Who are the organizers? Where are the parents? Where are the teachers? Our districts are under a tremendous amount of pressure right now. There's a lot of activity all across our region, and it's really fraught. And so finding the place, if you don't yet feel connected and informed, finding the right places to listen first is really critical. But I guarantee there is a lot of activity wherever you are already. And I also guarantee there isn't anybody on the ground, there isn't any small organization or group that cannot benefit from your particular expertise. The lawyers in our town have helped to rewrite parts of our charter, advocate for very particular policy change in both our town and our school district. And that's not their day job, right? That's just other stuff they do before they brush their teeth after they brush their teeth in the morning, before they brush their teeth at night. And so we need you in lots of different ways, and hope to see somebody out there.
I have one final follow-up. You and Renee Adelaide mentioned that everyone needs to understand CRT, critical race theory, white supremacy, how racism impacts them in their daily life. And I think one of the kind of most damaging myths is the idea, without diminishing, of course, the enormous harm that occurs to the victims of racial oppression, but we are all impacted by racism in a way that is negative. We think that it is privilege. And so I think that, again, without diminishing the harm that comes to victims of racial oppression, how do we understand, what message can we give to say, this actually damages all of us? You know, those taxes that are used to maintain privilege actually could be used to make the world a better place, literally, in different ways. Could you speak a little bit to that, if you would?
Yeah, I just wanted to leave a space for Renee. So maybe I'll start it off and then pass it to her. So I think about that often. It's also just being candid, like that, grappling with that is a lifelong journey for someone like me. Understanding the ways that how broken our system is also not advantageous to me or my family is really, really complex and layered and nuanced. And so I hold that in primarily two different ways. So one is, a broken society doesn't work for anyone. None of our divides are wide enough and deep enough that anybody's insulated. I think most of us would probably agree it's been a really difficult year. And I think we need no other reminder than 2020 to better understand that our fates are tied together, and healthy systems drive a healthy society. So we can't keep investing in breaking and divesting from in our own humanity. I also really believe that there's a lot of tenets of white culture that aren't advantageous for anyone, including white people. And so for me and for my family, identifying the ways in which we would like to lean out of whatever's best for me is what I'm going to choose to do, and into more of a, our sense of humanity and love and safety and care and concern is important. And it is a demonstration of how we care for each other that we choose to be in this world. And so, yeah, I'll pass it to Renee, but that's some of how I make sense of what you were asking about, Alex.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a really great question. I think, again, it's a very personal journey and a very personal set of understandings and conclusions each of us has to work and draw on our own over time. There's not a quick fix. There's not a quick answer. This is to Rep Bush's point, this is the ongoing work. I would say, in my own understanding of my own white privilege, I think for me, no one wants to learn that they're winning the game because they were given the extra tools to win it, that they started the race 100 years earlier because of where their ancestors got to get because of different policies. And so I think it's important and incumbent upon all of us to commit to the work of anti-racism and to commit to the understanding of how it has impacted your personal life, so that you can start to peel back the layers of where you were benefited, where you benefited, where your family has historically benefited, and then recognizing that, like, you won the game because you got to cheat. And our system was designed to help me as a white person essentially cheat. And I don't want to live in a system that is built like that. I want to live in a system that is, really intentionally working to ensure everyone's got a fair shot at this thing we call life. And right now, that's not the case.
Okay, thank you so much, all three of you, both for the work that you're doing and for your time today. It's a lot to chew on and think about how we can best move forward. Okay, so we were scheduled for a break. We're running a little bit over, so we're gonna just go ahead to the next session. Obviously, if you need to run, turn your camera off, do what you need to do and come back. So I'm gonna turn it over now to Alex, who's gonna introduce the next panel.
Good morning, folks. How are you? Thank you so much for attending. We have, I see 247 participants, and just to let you know, we were talking about this beforehand, and they apparently, for large events, it's not uncommon to have 30 to 40% attrition, and we had 295 people signed up, 247 present, so I don't think we are anywhere close to 40% attrition. So we very much value your time. To this question here about the messaging that's been brought up in the chat, it is so important, I think, to understand when we are talking about intention, I personally don't think that the entirety of our legislative body is completely unaware of the systemic impact. I think we are seeing in this period of history that some of that work is very, very intentional. But even for those of us that are inadvertently benefiting from the systems that privileged us, then for that group, I would say it's important for us to educate. And these systems were designed intentionally. I like to give the example of my grandfather, great-grandfather actually, and coming over, and in one of the earliest forms of gentrification here in this country, the Land Acts of the 1860s, taking land literally from Native Americans and being given to Europeans. That was with design, right? But I wasn't alive then. My kids weren't alive then. So what do we do now? And we have to dismantle these systems with intention, whether we are combating people who are intentionally perpetuating them, or we are combating our own ignorance and coming to understand how our own privilege perpetuates them and our own participation. I like to use the phrase drop anchor and take stock. I borrowed it from another attorney friend who owns her small business and works in this area as well. taking a look at what your sphere of influence is and what can I do. So as a result of this, this particular event, you're hearing many different calls to action and many different ways to get involved. The people that we have coming up have done so. We are looking forward to hearing from Mayor Jorge Elorza of Guatemalan Heritage, who will talk to us about how he has led his community in, with intention, dismantling the systems that were put into place by our grandfathers. You know, at the inception of the country, this is the state of the Missouri Compromise, right? There have always been racist and anti-racist forces in this country vying for control since its inception. And so we have these great speakers coming up. Nicholas Cummings, you know, we had the opportunity in organizing this of just having one panelist speak on one discrete area. And what this really should be like is kind of a buffet, like all of these ideas. And are you interested in getting involved in your schools? Do you want to help with the coding for tiny homes? All of these are opportunities that you can get involved in. John Gunn mentioned the Missouri Bars opportunities as well. So there's lots of different things to do. Nicholas Cummings is a great speaker who will talk to us about risk mitigation. We're already hearing concerns, very valid concerns being raised about, well, how do we use these terms and how do we educate and so forth. And his job is risk mitigation, how to handle that. So all three speakers, I won't take up any more time because it is 11 o'clock and I'll toss it over to Malini, but we have a great panel to talk to you exactly about how some of these solutions can be devised. Thank you so much again for attending and for the Missouri History Museum for hosting this huge event, which I was too afraid to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We are excited to start our third and final panel, which will be discussing environmental injustice in St. Louis and of course nationally as well. Welcome to everyone. A reminder to stay on mute unless you're a panelist. If you have any questions that you want to ask, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. We will be monitoring it during the panel. First, I'd like to have Professor Tara Rocque speak. She's a professor at Washington University, and as a member of their interdisciplinary environmental clinic, she managed the authorship of a extensive report on environmental injustice in St. Louis. So Professor Rocque, if you could please present your findings and let us know what environmental injustice is and how it's played out in St. Louis.
Sure, let me just share my screen real quick. How are you today? So as Malini said, I am Tara Rocque and I'm with the Interdisciplinary Environmental Clinic, and I'm here to talk to you about this report, Environmental Racism in St. Louis. Now, this report is the result of a collaboration with the clinic, Art City Defenders, Sierra Club, Action St. Louis, and Dutchtown South Community Corporation. And our report, what we did was we looked at 8 environmental justice indicators. And just generally, environmental justice is the reality that environmental factors, toxins, do not affect people equally. Black people, people of color, Native Americans, and Hispanic Americans are exposed to greater levels of environmental toxins than white people in this country, just overall. And what we did was we looked at it specifically with the city of St. Louis. And we looked at 8 environmental justice indicators chosen by the groups with which we worked. We looked at lead exposure, asthma rates, air pollution, vacancy, illegal dumping, mold exposure, food access, and energy burdens. Without exception, we found that Black St. Louisans are disparately impacted by all of these issues. Collectively, the end result is decreased health, increased poverty, and decreased quality of life. I'm going to highlight some of my findings today, and I'm also going to share some of our suggested recommendations. This is a lot to cover in 10 minutes. Our full report is available at the website on the bottom of this slide if you want to learn more. The first thing I want to talk about is lead. As we all know, lead is a bad thing. There are no safe levels of lead, and it particularly harms children. Now, lead paint was banned in 1978, and approximately 90% of the houses in this city were built before that time. So you'd expect that approximately 90% of our population has equal exposure to lead, but that's not the case. Lead exposure rates are not the same between Black and white children. Black children are 2.4 times more likely to test positive for lead in their blood, and they constitute 70% of all children suffering from lead poisoning in this city. Similar disparities exist when you look at asthma. Now, standing alone, St. Louis is one of the worst cities in the country for asthma. Just, it's bad. But Black St. Louisans, and particularly Black children, bear the brunt of this problem. If you look at the numbers, in the city of St. Louis, for every 1,000 children, approximately 4 of them will end up in the ER for asthma each year. But when you look at asthma rates for Black children in this city, that increases to 42 ER visits every year for every 1,000 Black children. That's a rate 10.8 times higher than white children, a huge disparity. Air pollution, it leads us to air pollution. Now, air pollution, as we all know, worsens asthma and damages lungs. It also contributes to premature death, is linked to cardiovascular problems, and is also linked to adverse birth outcomes. St. Louis, as a city, is ringed by 4 coal-fired power plants. So as a general matter, we have poor air quality, particularly with respect to ozone pollution and fine particle pollution. But again, the air pollution in this city is not spread equally. And that is because the majority of air pollution sources and the majority of demolitions, which are a major factor in creating air pollution, are in majority Black neighborhoods, which take a bad situation, a city full of poor air quality, and make it significantly worse for a particular subset of our population, namely Black St. Louisans. And despite this widespread problem, there are only 4 functioning air monitors in the entire city, 2 of which are only 2,500 feet apart from each other. Vacancy and illegal dumping are 2 issues that are inexorably tied together. And that's because vacant lots and properties practically invite illegal dumping, and excessive illegal dumping in turn increases vacancy rates because people who can move out of a neighborhood often do when there is a significant amount of dumping in it. St. Louis is one of the worst cities in the nation for vacancy. I believe it's the 3rd worst in the nation for vacancy. Approximately 90% of vacant properties are concentrated in majority Black neighborhoods. 25% of all vacant properties in this city can be found within 3 neighborhoods: Wells Goodfellow, Jeff Vanderloo, and Greaterville. This map that I have up here, each red dot represents 1 vacant property, and the Black modeling represents where majority Black neighborhoods are. As you can see, in portions of much of North St. Louis and portions of South St. Louis, there are so many vacant properties, you cannot even differentiate among each other. Illegal dumping, as I said, they're intertwined, and not surprisingly, the majority of illegal dumping occurs in majority Black neighborhoods. And when I say illegal dumping, I'm not talking about litter or someone failing to put a trash bag in a dumpster. I'm talking about large-scale dumping. People dumping old tires, construction waste, demolition waste, often by the truckload in our city's streets, alleys, and in lots, even on people's front yards. Now, illegal dumping is a huge problem in this city. To put a number to it, in the year 2017, approximately 22,000 tons of waste were illegally dumped in our city's streets and alleys. By comparison, only 9,000 tons of waste were properly disposed of the city's transfer stations. So more than twice the amount of waste was illegally dumped than was properly disposed of in transfer stations. The harm continues. For each metric we examined, Black St. Louis residents consistently were exposed to outsized harms and disparate treatment. Looking at food access, Black St. Louisans are almost twice as likely to have limited access to healthy food than white St. Louisans. Mold. Black St. Louisans are exposed to greater rates of mold in their homes, an issue that leads to increased asthma and respiratory illnesses. And home energy burdens, which is the percentage of income that you spend on energy for your home. Black St. Louisans pay outsized amounts for energy to heat their homes and cool their homes per square foot, bearing a burden nearly twice that of the average St. Louis household. In fact, out of the 48 major cities in the United States, St. Louis placed the 6th highest burden on Black households. I've gone over a lot, but one thing that struck us as we put this together is how interrelated all these issues are. And this sort of mess that I have up here is a thought experiment that our students put together when they were trying to separate the issues to make sense of them and realizing that they could not be separated. All of these issues are connected. They cause each other, they worsen each other, and they perpetuate each other in a never-ending cycle of harm. And the harms caused by environmental justice issues largely stem from 3 main causes: poor air quality, unsafe homes, and insufficient investment and care of the built environment in majority Black neighborhoods. You can see the effects of these environmental justice disparities everywhere, particularly in health outcomes. The recent the current COVID-19 outbreak is a prime example. According to the city statistics, I just checked them yesterday, the per capita death rates for Black residents exceeded those for white residents by over 61%. So that leads us to the big question: what can be done? And the answer is a lot, quite a lot, frankly. Now, the suggestions that I'm giving are more changes in law and policy, because frankly, that is what is needed. We have systemic issues created by the public sphere, and they need to be changed at the public level. And I've divided some ideas that we have and some thoughts we have into 3 buckets: at the federal level, state level, and local level. Now, there's much more that can be done. These are just some examples. One thing is the Environmental Justice and Data Mapping Collection Act that's actually proposed by Representative Bush. And it provides a fantastic mechanism to identify and address environmental justice issues. I suggest everyone learn more about that. As a country, we need more funding and grants for environmental justice initiatives. And just as a general matter, the country needs to improve its laws and regulations to promote renewable energy, clean air, and water, particularly because the last 4 years have seen a number of dangerous rollbacks in those areas. At the state level, we need to ensure that there are sufficient functioning air quality monitors throughout the city, and particularly in North St. Louis. Something that's noteworthy and needed is that we need to have people of color and people from urban areas on the Missouri Air Conservation Commission, which is the commission that helps place these monitors. This commission has long been dominated by rural white voices. Expanding Missouri's Medicaid program would be a fantastic step to ensure that those harmed by environmental injustices have access to the medical services needed to identify, diagnose, and alleviate the harms caused by environmental injustices. Improving landlord-tenant laws is so important. Black St. Louisans are more likely to live in rental housing, and Missouri law, as you've heard throughout the day, is notoriously landlord-friendly. Tenants need the ability to exercise their right to a safe home through things such as codifying a warranty of habitability and revising the rent and repair statute. The state needs to increase public funding for and access to lead and mold abatement programs so that our homes and schools are safe for our children. And it needs to promote renewable energy to reduce the state's reliance on coal-fired power. At the local level, the city should engage in a citywide data collection effort to determine how and why environmental injustices persist, and use that data to appropriately target relief efforts. Improve occupancy and building codes, ensuring that energy efficiency, mold, and water seepage issues are targeted by code enforcement officials. Right now, mold is not an issue that inspectors can look at or cite a landlord for. We need to increase targeted code enforcement for vacant properties. And this is important, focusing on absentee out-of-state landowners, not causing further harm to people that are already harmed by the current environmental justice problems in the city. And we need to improve the improve the quantity and quality of green spaces in the city, increasing investment in areas that have long been neglected by the city, improve access to public transportation, particularly in North St. Louis, and decrease the cost of that transportation so that communities have better access to healthy foods, promote and support urban agriculture, and provide tax incentives for grocery stores operating in the city's food deserts. So I know those were more policy issues rather than things that a lawyer can do and file a lawsuit, but really these are where the changes need to happen to fix these systemic issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rocque. You know, the whole point of this CLE was to discuss problems as well as solutions. So I'd like to introduce our next speakers after this introduction to environmental issues in St. Louis. We'll start with Mayor Jorge Elorza. He is the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, where they just started a Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission. And Mayor Elorza, it would be helpful if you could provide us some information about this commission and also how the commission can address environmental injustice specifically, and then sort of just larger social justice issues that we've been discussing today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Malini, and welcome everybody. You know, I want to begin by just commending the St. Louis Bar Association, or whoever it is that put together this CLE, for taking this issue on. And you know, I can tell you, listening to Professor Rocque's presentation, you know, it was definitely eye-opening. The specific statistics, so many of them are harrowing, but specifically that 90% of all vacancies are in Black neighborhoods in the city. There is clearly a deep racial disparity, and by raising awareness about it and being solutions oriented in our discussion, you know, there are definitely things that we can do. So I'm happy to share with you the approach that we've taken. And Malini, I'll do my best to answer your specific question, but if I can provide the context for it, I think it'd be very helpful. So we, as just about every city in the country, struggle with issues of race. And our makeup is slightly different. We're a city of 180,000 people, and the largest minority group here are Latinos. So about 44% of our city's residents are Latinos, and African Americans make up only about 17% of our community. Yet many of the same challenges that y'all are experiencing in St. Louis, we have here as well. And this all particularly rose to the surface during COVID. When we started seeing that COVID was having a disproportionate impact on communities of color, I convened a number of different groups, one of those groups being a group of leaders in the African American community, and we call that group the African American Ambassador Group, the Triple AG. And ostensibly that was about getting the word out about the pandemic and keeping the community informed. But then George Floyd happened. And as soon as that occurred, we intentionally pivoted, where we started talking about larger issues of racial injustice and specific anti-Blackness that still exists in our community. And as Alexandra mentioned, going back to the Missouri Compromise, you know, we acknowledge that race has always been one of the underlying issues in our society. It was one of, if not the, divisive issues during the Constitutional Convention. 40 years later, during the Missouri Compromise in 1820, it was the issue. About 35 years later, with the Kansas Act, allowing Kansas into the Union, once again, that was the issue, and that eventually led to the Civil War. There were maybe 12 years of Reconstruction where things got better, but then we reverted back to our policies, and that takes us into the modern day civil rights movement, where we certainly made some progress, but we haven't gone far enough. And I use that historical context to ask the rhetorical question. So, you know, what are we going to do? Are we going to treat the race issue the way that we always have, by not addressing it directly and look to see where it's gotten us? Or are we going to address it directly? So with the conversations that I had with this group, I meet with this Triple AG group every single week for an hour and a half every Thursday morning. And this group has grown from about 20 community leaders to over 100 active participants. We have subcommittees. I have about 20 to 30 of my staff members that help organize and move this work forward. And as I mentioned, I participate in every single one of these meetings for the full hour and a half. And the reason why we've done this is, as Professor Rocque mentioned, it's so important to make sure that Black voices are at the decision-making table. And we want to make sure that we lift the voices of our Black community and amplify them so that they are setting the city's policies and they are influencing the city's agenda in a way that it's never happened before. And so, as we've had these conversations, we came to understand that the wounds run so deep that if we really want to make the most out of this post George Floyd moment, then we have to go to the source. And as a group, we decided collectively to launch this truth, reconciliation, and reparations process. So it's a 3-phase process. Every step of the process is as important as the other, but the magic really happens when it comes together. And so for the truth portion, which we're currently in, we hired a team of local researchers, and they're putting together a 400-year history of the African-American community's treatment in our city and state. And they're uncovering a number of truths that we just frankly, most of us weren't aware of, but that we hope are going to become fingertip knowledge for us, and that we hope to share very broadly with the Providence community and integrate this into our curriculum in our schools. And once the truth phase is done, we plan to launch a reconciliation process. And in this reconciliation process, we're not the first city or the first country that would go through something like this. Other folks have done it. And what you do is you take perhaps one of the most divisive issues in society, and you actually use it to bring people together. And I believe that's the impact that this is going to have here in Rhode Island. And so we're modeling this from truth and reconciliation commissions that have happened in many war-torn countries previously, and that have been done very successfully. So I see this as a way to actually bring our community together on an issue that has historically been divisive. And then last, we put a marker in the ground that we are committed to municipal reparations. Now that does not mean that we can right every wrong of the past. In fact, it's impossible for any city to do that. But I think it's important for us to put this marker into the ground and encourage both other institutions in our city and also other levels of government that we work with, that they also take on this reparations question and find different ways to make that happen. Now, a quick note on reparations, and then I'll come back to your more specific question, Malini. So in the coming months, I'm going to create a committee on reparations, and I'm going to task them with making recommendations for what shape reparations should take here in Providence. And they are not limited in any way. I plan to give them free rein to come up with whatever they determine are the best way to make right by the racial wrongs of the past. Now, again, this doesn't mean that the city is going to be in a position to fulfill every single one of them, but I want to make sure that we empower Black voices in our community and that we collectively go through this conversation is what is just in this situation. And then the responsibility will be on myself, on other municipal leaders, and on other institutional leaders to do right as best we can from what we hear are the community's priorities. Now, there are several things that have already come out of the work that we've done. We led a historic effort to change the state's official name. The state's official name used to be the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. 10 years ago, when it was put up to referendum, it failed miserably, 80-20. This year, we made a really strong push, and it actually passed. A majority of Rhode Islanders chose to delete Providence Plantations from the state's name. And as you can imagine, this really both excited folks and also really opened all of our eyes to what happens when we're all working together. Other initiatives that we have launched is a guarantee to provide a free attorney for everyone who's being evicted in our housing courts. Now we know, and this is the work that I used to do as an attorney out of law school, I know for a fact that having an attorney is the difference between being able to transition from your apartment into another home versus showing up one day and all your things are out on the sidewalk and you're sleeping in a shelter that night. That smooth transition or providing that opportunity for transition is incredibly important for low-income communities. And as Matthew Desmond says in his book Evicted, which is just an incredible book, oftentimes we think of evictions being a symptom of poverty. He says it's actually the other way around. Poverty is a symptom. Poverty is a symptom of evictions. Once you get evicted, it's so difficult to pull yourself out of that. And to tie it into environmental justice specifically, we've also created a racial and environmental justice committee. And they led the city's effort to create our environmental justice plan. So this is a long-term plan. We have a plan that by 2050, we will be carbon neutral as a society. But we've adopted the same process and the same approach that we have with the AAAG group. So we start by empowering the voices of frontline communities, people who are on the front lines of climate change and feel its effect first and feel it the most. Ironically enough, it's also these communities that are least responsible for carbon emissions that contribute to climate change. But we put their voices first. And they came up with this beautiful, beautiful document that's people-centered, and we've adopted this as our formal plan for the city of Providence. And it's not something that just lives and dies in our sustainability office, but it's something that's integrated into every department throughout the city. And so this is real systems and policy level change that's being driven by our community. The last piece that I'll mention before I hand it back is, how does this relate to legal questions that we all have to wrestle with? So much of this is indeed policy, but I think there's one really important legal question that we're very conscious of here and that we're navigating. So as we've launched this reparations process, how race conscious can we be in our policy, in the policies that we set going into the future? And that ties directly into the truth phase of our truth, reconciliation, and reparations process. By establishing that the treatment of African Americans in our community has been directly led, not just de facto, but de jure, by our community and by our city in the past, we believe that this gives us more flexibility to be race conscious in our solutions going forward. So obviously this is an area where it's almost uncharted, untapped territory, but we're very conscious of the legal constraints that we're working within, and we want to make sure that the entire community is familiar with that. So we work forward in the smartest, most strategic way. So again, I thank you all for taking on this issue, and I hope that some of the experience that we're going through here in Providence is helpful to what you're doing in St. Louis.
Thank you very much, Mayor Elorza. That was very helpful and actually transitions well to our next speaker. We'll be hearing from Nicholas Cummings, who is an attorney who works for the city of Evanston in Illinois, so a little closer to home. And Mr. Cummings, I would appreciate hearing from you about Evanston's take on the issue of reparations. Your city approached it a little differently. You passed resolutions regarding reparations. If you could talk to us about Evanston's approach, and also, if you can, within that discussion, discuss how you're addressing environmental injustices in Evanston, and if you can jump in, that would be great.
Thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate Alexandra working with me in terms of time flexibility. Incidentally enough, the City of Evanston's subcommittee on reparations met this morning at 9:15, which is why I was not able to be on the panel at 9 o'clock addressing housing. So I do appreciate you guys working with me on as far as that's concerned. As stated, I am the Deputy City Attorney for the City of Evanston. The City of Evanston in 2019, and actually a little bit before that, took on the idea of trying to establish a reparations program. And in that, they passed a resolution that established a reparations fund. And I will say, and I should make the commentary first, that these views and opinions are my own and not those of the city of Evanston. And anything that you hear about what I have to say is not necessarily a criticism of my employer, but lessons learned from my my post and from observing other municipalities like Providence, and even hearing from some of you with respect to Missouri and St. Louis today. But I will state that Providence and even the research with respect to St. Louis in the environmental space is headed in the right direction and actually doing that research first. Evanston just happened to have the political will at the time in order to pass that resolution to establish the reparations fund. So that's why Evanston's approach is a little bit different. As you can probably note on the national level with House Bill 40, and as Mayor Elorza stated a minute ago, that they're doing this research, to try and establish, what that will look like ahead of time. Instead, Evanston took the initiative and established a reparations fund based on recently approved recreational cannabis sales, taking that tax and putting it into a fund and committing $10 million of that over the course of 10 years. And from how that sort of happened, there was some litigation in the Northern District of Illinois by descendants of slaves that tried to sue private entities for reparations. And this is not unique in any way. It just happened to be probably the more recent in 2005. And that case was dismissed among a variety of reasons, but the court took the stance that reparations was a political question. And so that's why I say that it takes political will to make these things happen, and why Evanston was able to pass that resolution at the time, because it's not a question that can be answered in the courts. It has to be done through legislative action. And how Evanston has been dealing with environmental justice, I will say that Evanston is relatively unique in the sense that environmental justice has not been a part of the reparations program per se. The city itself, being a lakefront city, takes the environmental question very seriously. I believe there's a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050 in the city. But we face unique issues in the sense of the fact that Lake Michigan is rising. We're already facing beach erosion in the city of Evanston. And as it's not unique to the city of St. Louis that some of the other environmental factors that impact Black residents also impact the Black residents of the city of Evanston. The city of Evanston is a much smaller percentage of Black residents. I believe it's about 9% of the city's population is African American or Black, but nonetheless, they still feel those impacts. So that particular question has not been answered with respect to reparations work, but housing and economic development have been the primary focuses of reparations thus far. I did want to point out two other points before I yield the rest of my time, because I got on the call and I heard there being a discussion about dismantling these structural things that are in place that harm us. I've heard Mayor Elorza talk about the history that led us to this point. And primarily the reason why I told Alexandra my role is for the city of Evanston is risk mitigation, to try and make sure that the work that they're doing actually, I mean, we're going to get sued, but to ensure that we win. And reparations is definitely a major part of that dismantling, but some of the modern civil rights actions have actually become impediments to reparations work, in the sense that, it's difficult to have race-based programming to target making those things better. The very constitutional amendments that were put in place to help Black people are now the impediment to getting reparations to Black people. And so what my advice to the city of Evanston has been is, yes, we were able to pass the resolution to promise to commit a certain amount of money, and that might fall within the political question doctrine, but the distribution of, or any sort of program that spends that money might be subject to strict scrutiny. And so what the city has done, at my insistence, which is sort of counterintuitive to my role in protecting the city as its attorney, is there's been a lot of research done about the historical practices of the city of Evanston with respect to discrimination. And on the city of Evanston's website, there is now it's over 100 pages documenting the evidence of discrimination in the city of Evanston, either by the city or the city's acquiescence to such discrimination. And that's why I say the city of Providence research is so important. The research that was presented with respect to environmental injustice in St. Louis is so important. Because when it comes to strict scrutiny, City of Richmond versus J.A. Croson tells us that you have to be able to back it up. The city's efforts have to be backed up by specific research. Alexandra talked about clearing out Native Americans in the past. As recently as 1940, the city of Evanston was clearing out Black people from their homes under the guise of urban blight. So, if you have that evidence and you can say, well, we can identify that these were the people that were harmed. The city of Evanston has adopted, or at least is working on, a policy to try and repair or restore people who would have what we normally describe as derivative claims, relatives of people who were harmed at that particular time, but it's still targeted to that specific harm. And that would be sort of my advice to anybody that is working to try and do restorative work, is it needs to be able to, especially if it's going to be race-based, it's going to need to be able to pass strict scrutiny, and you're going to need that evidence in your back pocket when someone comes to sue you, and you have to say, well, my municipality or my government entity has evidence that we actually caused this harm, and we have a basis for wanting to restore it.
Mr. Cummings, you sort of actually preempted a question I had for you, which is, it sounds like Evanston has not yet had any lawsuits filed against them with regards to these reparations ordinances, or have they? And in addition to your risk management, how have you handled the litigation?
Evanston has not yet been sued with respect to passing the resolution or any of the resolutions. And as I stated, I think I would be competent in that being a political question that the courts would not get involved in. How a municipality or how a body politic spends its money is sort of protected by at least in Illinois, it's protected by the Illinois Constitution. And understandably, we have a strong argument under Article 3 in terms of the ability for the courts to intercede to a case in controversy at the federal level on how a local municipality chooses to spend its money. I do expect, and as I took my role in Evanston and was assigned this particular subcommittee to advise, I do expect that once the city starts to try and spend that money, that we will have someone to try and challenge the program and the constitutionality of that program being based on race. And I do expect that someone who would not meet the eligibility criteria to apply be rejected and then sue us claiming an equal protection violation.
Mayor Elorza, a similar question to you. Have you yet had any legal actions taken with regards to your Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission, or are you anticipating any, and how is the city preparing for it?
Well, let me begin by saying to Nicholas Cummings, thank you so much for that presentation. You know, we've been following what y'all are doing out in Evanston a great deal as well. So thank you for leading the way. And I just find it remarkable that a couple of years ago, there was the political will anywhere to pass a reparations bill. So kudos to you and to your community for that. And just let you know that the entire country is watching and learning from what you all are doing. In terms of us, we have not been sued yet, but just as Mr. Cummings mentioned, we fully anticipate that we will be sued. Particularly if we do decide to be race conscious in the way that we do reparations, which frankly I think makes sense. But anyhow, we are anticipating this, and that's why we're going very carefully through this truth process, doing our research and making sure that we're uncovering these truths from our history, not just for they to be more publicly and commonly known and understood, which is tremendously important, to bring the history to life and show that history is not just a thing of the past, but it's something that actively shapes the future. So we're doing it for all of those reasons, but on top of that, we're also doing it anticipating that we may have to defend the actions that we take in court. And we're very familiar with the Supreme Court's decisions in this space, and we know that if the entity that is adopting a race-conscious measure is also the same entity that has been responsible for discrimination in the past, then it is more likely that that race-conscious measure would be upheld. So we're walking into this very, very well aware of the case law in this space and doing what we can to address any potential challenges in the future with the steps that we're taking now.
Professor Rocque, to bring it kind of full circle back to St. Louis then, you had mentioned that there is legislation that was sponsored by Representative Bush to address environmental justice at the federal level. I was wondering if you could talk about that bill and then any other sort of legislative priorities that you think could address the issues here in St. Louis.
Sure, of course I could. And let me just, that name of the bill is a mouthful, so quickly let me pull it up so I can get the name right for you. And while I'm pulling up the name to get it for you, it is a bill that was recently proposed by, here we go. It is the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act. And it was proposed by Representative Bush along with Senator Markey and about 28 or 29 other representatives and senators. And what the bill seeks to do is, it's my understanding that it was actually somewhat inspired by our clinic's report, which we think is pretty amazing. And what it seeks to do is to use the federal, the amount of data and resources that the federal government has, and use that to conduct a nationwide analysis of environmental justice to determine where are environmental justice the worst, where are educational issues the worst, where is gun violence, where are gun violence issues the worst. Take that all together and sort of map the country to see where the issues are greatest and what issues are greatest in different regions of the country. And then use the data gathered there to actually target funding. So instead of just throwing money across the country, actually do a targeted funding efforts where that money is needed and for what that money is needed. And as written right now, the bill intends to direct where 40% of the government's climate-related spending will be. So if this bill is enacted, it could be a huge boon for the communities that have been forgotten by our country for so long, that have been harmed and marginalized by our countries for so long, because they have not had voices at the table to say, no, don't put that power plant in my neighborhood. No, don't put that trash transfer station in my backyard. No, don't cut through our community and build that highway. All of these things that people, marginalized communities, have not had the voice to change and to determine what happens in their communities. Now funds can come to them to start to repair some of the damage that has been done for so long. In the city of St. Louis, the city of St. Louis has a very difficult history when it comes to funding and harm to Black communities. Anyone here knows about the Del Mar divide, which is essentially money is not spent above Del Mar. There is a lot of talk, the Team 4 report, if you are familiar with it, which was sort of a report that determined how funding should go in the St. Louis going forward. And it essentially said that North St. Louis should be left to die on the vine. Don't hurt it, don't help it. Just let it go because it's too far gone. And as a result of that determination, money has continuously been funneled into the city's central corridor, and North St. Louis has been left on its own. And it's been harmed consistently through historic redlining, through disinvestment, through disenfranchisement. And we need data-based efforts in order to reverse that cycle of harm.
Professor Rocque, do you know of any legislative actions that are currently being considered or evaluated in Missouri or St. Louis to address these sorts of harms in St. Louis?
Frankly, no, I don't. Our legislature is very focused on sort of our rural communities and not so much on what goes on in our urban areas. We also don't have sufficient voices to really promote environmental justice issues in the state legislature, which is unfortunate because it's a need that needs to be addressed. If we want to improve our collective health, if we want to improve our collective safety, if we want to improve our collective wealth, we really need to raise everyone up. It can no longer be just raising up the people that already have what they need. We need to collectively help those that have been marginalized. And no, I am not aware of anything. That's not to say that something has not been proposed, but it's not on my radar at this moment.
Well, one of the benefits of or possibilities of reparations is that it can address not just environmental justice issues, but other issues as well. We have about 5 minutes left, but this question came in through our chat and I'd like to direct it to Mayor Elorza and Mr. Cummings. How do your respective cities anticipate using the reparation funds? You know, do you have a sense of where that money would go? And the question specifically asked about housing and how reparation funds could address housing discrimination. Mayor Elorza, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll start off by pointing to what Evanston has done, which I think is brilliant. They've identified that a great source of the black-white wealth gap comes through homeownership, and discrimination based on access to federally insured mortgages. Compounded over generations leads first and foremost to the wealth disparity that we currently have. And I think about the day after the financial fallout of 2008. If you look at wealth throughout the country the day after, nonetheless, with the crash of the housing market, the majority of Americans still held the majority of their wealth in equity in their homes. That's how powerful a wealth building tool access to home ownership has been, and Blacks were systematically left out from the founding of the FHA to throughout the civil rights era. And so what Evanston has done, I think, is brilliant and provides a fund to allow first-time home buyers who can trace their families, or they can trace harm back to a certain period in the city's history. Again, we don't know what shape recommendations is going to take here in Providence, because we plan to create a committee, and the committee will make recommendations to us. But I truly anticipate that some form of what Evanston has done will also be recommended here. At the same time, we know that homeownership just isn't attainable for everyone. And there are a lot of people that are going to continue to live in our community as tenants. And that's where support for tenants also comes in. The city of Providence, we recently passed a law making source of income an illegal means of discrimination in our city. So that shows our commitment to this work. But also, I want to make sure that we endow or fully fund for the long term these attorneys for people getting evicted from housing court. So there's so many ways that we can address the challenges, the housing challenges, whether it's wealth building or at least providing more security. But again, we're open to the recommendations that the community will make, and then it's on us to make them real.
Mr. Cummings, do you have any details to add regarding Evanston's plans for funding?
Sure, and I will admit that the plans that have been put forth have not necessarily been broadly accepted by the community itself. A lot of people want direct payment for those simple reasons that Mayor Elorza points out. Is not everyone's ready for home ownership, or there may be some people who are later on in life who don't anticipate buying another home. But the Evanston program has sort of evolved to include mortgage assistance, repair of an existing home, as well as maybe even, although I have not legally agreed to it, the tax assistance. So people who have tax problems on their homes, using some of the funding to pay down back taxes. I will say I have to applaud Providence for getting rid of source of income as a basis for discrimination, because we all know that income has been used instead of race. Once race could no longer be a consideration, we expect that income can be a substitute. And that's when we talk about low-income housing, we're usually talking about impacting Black and brown people. But the last thing I will say is that in addition to trying to put those funds into homeownership, I'm also been pushing the elected officials to try and pressure the lenders to help increase housing stock in the city of Evanston, because in addition to, and I don't know exactly how much people know about the city of Evanston, with it being a lakeside city, real estate is expensive. And the one thing they're not making any more of is property, right? So that's why it's such an essential part to build wealth. So housing, the average cost of a house in the city of Evanston is $400,000. And you have a huge amount of people that would not be able to afford that, even with the down payment assistance that the reparations program is trying to deliver them. So what the city needs is for a developer to be committed to build housing stock that's in a more affordable range that isn't necessarily 80% of the AMI, in order for them to get tax credits from the federal government. So, you know, we are still trying to evolve that program, but it has been targeted to housing. And the next program, I believe, will be with respect to economic development in the city.
Well, thank you for that information, and thank you to our panelists discussing environmental injustice, but also reparations as a potential workable solution for addressing social justice issues. We are out of time, so I invite our current panelists to jump on the chat if they have time to answer any outstanding questions. But to conclude our program, I'd like to first thank Lindsay Newton of the Missouri Historical Society for hosting this CLE for us today. Of course, thank you to all of our speakers who are incredibly informed and informative for educating us on these important social justice issues here in St. Louis and clearly nationally. And thank you to everyone in our audience who joined us today. We were really glad to have this conversation with you and hope to continue it in the future. As this is a CLE, you will be receiving an email with a certificate of attendance. This is for you to keep track of how many hours you attended, but you can use that form to do so. There will also be a survey, so we would appreciate if you can provide your feedback on our panel today, on our 3 panels today, and any suggestions you have for future joint CLEs. Again, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, muchas gracias, alcalde Elorza, muchísimas gracias. Orgullo Latinx. Tenemos a varios líderes latinos aquí en este evento. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much, everyone. Just reiterating, thank you all. Malini's done a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Get into some good trouble, everybody. You have some real roadmaps here. Get into some good trouble now. Get to it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
¿Cómo se apaga esta vaina?
Esta vaina. Qué chistoso.
Great program, Alex.
Thank you so much. I don't know who that was, but thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Matt. Good to see you. Another longtime fighter.
Gracias, Alejandra. Muy buen trabajo.
Gracias, igualmente.
Gracias, gracias. Y contestaron mi pregunta. Yes.
Qué bueno.
Gracias. Bye-bye.
Bye.